No, I like to go for a while because I have to, think about my patrons. So, yeah, but you were talking about making Agamben more accessible. And
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I was reading your essays and I think there's a lot to cover. I mean, the one about what was the one? The juridical rule in medieval times. Near the end, the one essay becomes clear, but I don't know. Anyways, before we go on, I always forget to do this. Usually it's like an hour in before I do it. So it's been a while since we talked, and well,
Yeah,
actually,
back in the Lev era.
back in the Fall of the Rules era. Yeah. With it was you and Carlsbad.
Yeah.
Maybe we could do that again here, but someday. Um, so what have you been up to? And you're thinking of writing a book, or have you written a book? And you're just chopping it out.
I have written the book. The problem is now, unlike most people, you usually find a publisher and then you write the book. I've written the book. Now I'm trying to find a publisher. I'm trying not to self-publish if I don't have to, but
yeah, that's usually how it goes. But yeah, like nowadays, I mean, yeah, I wonder if people already have the manuscript before they send it off. But yeah, so maybe give yourself an introduction, A to Z, if you will. Like, what do you do? My good friend Carl. So, yeah.
there are your papers. Well, without getting into too many specifics, what I've been doing and what I've been up to is well, first of all, I've been working on this Agamben project for a couple of months and just sort of ironing it out and making his work somewhat more accessible and a more easily digestible format. He's not incredibly difficult to read, but it can be kind of daunting, and especially his sort of mainstay is among the left, who overwhelmingly abandoned him when he decided not to get a XOR and a passport for it.
Ironically enough, yeah.
Yeah, and then they all turned on him. Even these, and it's funny because they would, this one guy, Adam Kotsko, who translated about a third of his stuff into English. He wrote this essay about crazy Uncle Agamben, and he said, well, it's true that this is sort of surprising, but it was basically in his work the whole time that he would react this way. And you think, how did you not? You're the guy who translated half the stuff. Like, how did you not predict this? This would be the kind of proper response. But a lot of the kind of postmodern leftists and academia who like to kind of draw on Foucault and Nietzsche and these sorts of figures, like it just transmutes into voting for Hillary. Or whatever mainline Democrat or kind of predictably center left party, whether it's a Liberal Party in Canada or Labour in Britain, and constantly wringing their hands about them and all this other absurd.
Yeah, in Canada, they'll wring their hands and vote for the NDP in academia.
Oh, that's even more pathetic. Yeah, you got Singh in charge, where you can, yeah.
Yeah, even like in the back in the day in like the 2000s, you'd have the early 2000s. You have like Jack Layton's my guy, even though you're like professor of like critical literature at Queen's University. It's kind of like now the liberals are just the. Sorry, I mean the NDP are just the Liberal Party now, but like more.
They can kind of launder your anxieties about voting for Justin Castro.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, voting for the stepson. So it's like it's like if you don't want to vote for him, just vote for Singh, and it's basically voting for Justin by proxy, which is like But no.
Besides that, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just gonna say something about like the terminal like anxiety of the like upper middle class academic like being found out. Like you may call him a scoundrel, a liar, but if you call him bourgeois, it's like watch as they record.
Yeah, that's right. Right. You don't want to be associated with anything that smacks of like Mr. Monopoly capitalism. You're a radical in your stupid bow tie or with your tattoo sleeve and your pink hair. And then these people are always funny because they'll complain about everyone except the university administration and the people who could fire them or like kind of can them.
Yeah, and people don't know this, but the administration really is the source of power, not the professors. It's the administration. That's
Yeah.
how, yeah. But people don't know that. People just like, I think like the problem is like conservatives, like the Jordan Peterson types also, they're like, it's always about the professors and their crazy ideas, but it's never about like how the university actually functions and operates, very similar to like government sponsored corporations, more or less, but not in like the based Musso sense, like the based Benny Musso sense, like the most like G slur G slur version of corporatism. But anyways, go ahead, Cal. Go ahead. Your introduction. You also have a podcast. Where you
Yeah.
discuss what
So
particular faith are you? You're Anglican, not Anglican.
yeah, so I'm kind of
Yeah.
reluctantly in that orbit, and that's without getting into all the kind of personal existential aspects of kind of weeding through uh, faith and
Yeah.
but I'm kind of what you would consider like sort of a high church Protestant. I'm fairly irenic. I think broader Christian unity between Catholics, Orthodox, evangelicals, wider Protestants around. I mean, this is why fundamentalists, that term is, even among more conservative types is an unwarranted slur, because the idea of fundamentalism when it happened in the early 20th century was this unity among core doctrines. Like we all believe in the virgin birth. We all believe in incarnation. We all believe in sort of the inerrancy of scripture, and that would then root the kind of shared moral fabric that Catholics, and back then it was just Protestants, but today Catholics, Orthodox, Protestants share in resisting, the whole variety of social acid that's just destroying families, destroying kind of the basic sense people have between what is a man, what is a woman, what is a family, how do these things relate within a country, and how does that become a foundation or source for culture. And so even though there are doctrinal differences, and this isn't what makes, this is what I would differentiate between being irenic and ecumenical, is, I'm not trying to get rid of the doctrinal differences. They're real and serious, but functional unity based on some core shared principles is more important. And, some of the kind of, you see this on Christian Twitter, this sort of confessional warfare. Not only is it kind of outmoded because it feels like it's like a dumb version of these 17th century polemics, but it's also just not helpful where, if you're Orthodox and you stress the importance of Orthodox Church, that's fine. Or you stress the importance of the Catholic Church, that's fine. But your average Novus Ordo parish may have a priest that's sort of secretly gay, or the Orthodox, they don't believe the scripture is real. They're just basically Episcopal priests with beards. And I'm exaggerating, but you can't ignore the problems in your own house to just go off and attack your enemies. Because usually it's sort of this cage stage thing, because a lot of these people were former evangelicals themselves.
I know a lot of Orthodox in America were former evangelicals.
Yeah,
or some Baptist. There's a lot in the South. Yeah, there's a lot in the South. Yeah,
and it's just about trying to cool tempers, to not try to rehash these battles without recognizing the fact that when it comes to ecclesiastical power, spiritual power, when it comes to Christians, it's a rapidly sliding minority. Churches are just imploding, and I asked this question one time and I didn't really get real answers. Like, how will Catholics come back from the Francis papacy? Is it just supposed to be a hope and a miracle? Is there a real strategy about reversing some of these magisterial effects? And I don't know. But we got to recognize the challenges of the 21st century for Christian faith.
It's, I mean, the reality is that when it comes to trad Catholics, it's entirely out of their hands, unfortunately. You know what I mean? Like me, I'm a lifelong Catholic cradle. I mean, Catholicism, as I said, is like a genetic religion to us Italians. So, but I can understand, like, I mean, I'm very sympathetic to Orthodoxy, but I know that the Orthodox, they have a very, like, maybe just like the terminally online ones. I think like the actual patriarchs that go to the Vatican and visit and whatever, they probably don't care to the degree of like converts. But I know that they have this like really big thing, and like an unwarranted suspicion, obviously, of like ecumenicalism, because ecumenicalism would essentially entail, from what they say, is the destruction of their faith and the destruction of other faiths of Christian sects, whether you're Anglican or Roman Catholic. Like, I mean, me, I had no, I mean, but you make a good distinction, though. I feel that you're focusing on the fundamentals there. But before we go on to surely your podcast, what is the difference? Because again, I'm like totally ignorant because I'm not American and I'm not a Protestant. But what is the difference? Meaning, like in I think in continental Europe this becomes a bit easier, but in America, what is the difference between the high church and the low church? You would say, like what distinguishes those terms in a sort of meaningful sense in the American context?
All right, so I mean, just as a preface, right, these terms are all kind of bent out of shape from their historical origin.
Yeah.
But in the vernacular, when you talk about high church or low church, it's do you have, so a high church setting would usually involve vestments, candles, crosses, a kind of prescribed liturgy. So Anglicans use the Book of Common Prayer. Your priest would be wearing a clerical collar, and usually a much stronger emphasis on the sacrament than taking the Lord's Supper. Low church in today's vernacular would mean,
strip mall.
Yeah, strip mall kind of church, right? I mean, these get like a bad rep because I've seen, you can find like Tridentine mass, like the old traditional Latin mass in the strip mall with like 20 people. So, you can't overly aestheticize. But yeah, if you're in a strip mall or even if you're in a more historic building, the pastor probably wears a suit. There's not really an emphasis on sacrament. You're probably not going to use vestments, candles, whatever. Usually it's contemporary Christian music for worship with guitar and drums and stuff. And then, obviously there's the more excessive stuff you see among Pentecostals with smoke machines and kind of like flashing lights and stuff. But that's usually what people think about when they think of low church, and not the sort of traditional kind of distinction of the clergy and the prescribed aspects of liturgy.
I snicker a little bit, but I got to admit that maybe, I don't know, maybe the guitar solo is inevitable for Catholic churches in America. I hate to say it, but it's what's the church? What's the sect that you basically, you go there, you sit down in a comfortable seat, and you sort of have a Bible study reflection thing rather than a service? What is that church? Pentecostal, or is it?
You would maybe find that sort of thing, and they would call themselves usually like Bible churches or Bible fellowships. These are kind of non-denominational Baptist type evangelical churches.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Interesting.
So I mean, there's just a lot of division, and it's trying to figure out like the common bonds that allow people to live together. To at least, what's the point if you melt down, you go on your warpath to wipe out all the other Christian churches so yours survives, but then you're an extreme minority, kind of crushed by the effects of global American empire. And you're just sort of shilling for some sort of Zion action that's running things.
I wonder though. I'm trying to, like, as I'm sitting here, I'm trying to determine your accent because it's how did you arrive at the Anglican faith, more or less? Like, like Catholicism or Orthodoxy? Or...
Yeah, it was the Anglican tradition is. Are
you an Anglo yourself, though, genetically? Are you? Because I'm trying to, like.
Yeah, no, I have a kind of, I don't sound English at all, but.
No, but I mean, are you an old stock American?
Yeah, I have. My family is primarily Germanic, and with some English and some Irish. But I have family that go back to the 18th century.
There you go. That's probably. Yeah. But yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I can. I passed my card, so I have legitimacy. No, I mean, a part of that, like there are a lot of things I dislike about Anglicans in practice. They can be very stuffy. The Episcopal Church is a complete nightmare. It's basically a coven of witches.
Yeah, I heard some horror stories about.
Yeah, they're bad.
Yeah.
There are these Anglican splinter groups in North America. Some of them are healthier. But the reason I find this appealing is I had this conversion experience, and I was sort of floating around as a low church evangelical. I always found church history very interesting. So when I first kind of took Christianity seriously, I started reading not only the Bible but then the church fathers. And I read them directly. I read secondary literature about that period, and I just found that the Anglican kind of doctrines were kind of comprehensive enough to sort of absorb some of this early church emphases, but at the same time, I did not feel like I had to abandon my kind of conversion and sort of Protestant experiences, because there are a lot of good people who are, it's like, all these converts, they might be Catholic, they might be Orthodox, but they still have some kind of kindly, pious grandma who's a Baptist. And so I don't want to turn my back on that heritage, but on the same time, I recognize its weaknesses.
Do you mean the evangelical church in America as it stands right now, more or less?
Yeah.
I mean, there's no one church, but evangelism, like evangelical, I think like people get the media depiction of it and like what the reality of it in a lot of these churches is quite different, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I mean, you could to talk about evangelicals. It's sort of a parachurch. It's an association of lots of different groups that have, usually they're Baptist or Presbyterian.
It's like the National Wrestling Alliance back in the day. You had your little territory here, but really it was they determined everything at the top, even though you had your little territory. Sorry.
Well, it's so no, that's fine. I mean, these churches sort of operate at a much more informal level, but so you don't, this is why Catholic apologists don't, some of them are intentionally ignorant, I think, because some of them were evangelicals, but they say, well, how are they supposed to decide? They're all just sort of making their own choices, but there is a sort of gravitational pull on social, cultural, and theological issues that even though you don't have some official teaching that says, how they should believe on particular things, your average evangelical believes Jesus is God, Jesus died for your sins, that this applied at social level, marriages between one man and one woman, blah 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 blah. And there is a great cultural and theological unity in a very broad sense, even though you don't have, these official statements. And of course, some of these churches, so like more conservative evangelical Presbyterian churches, they have confessions of faith that, go back to the 17th century.
They don't believe in saints either. They think that's idolatry. Is that true? Or?
Well, they wouldn't pray to saints, but it's sort of interesting because I tend to think that providentially God kind of guides everyone back onto the same path. So even though Reformed Christians were adamant about how you should not have images of, any kind of religious images, but your average Reformed Christian, whether they're kind of emerging out of the Baptist tradition or Methodist or Presbyterian, they'll have their nativity set. So there's almost this draw backwards to using images. There's a sense that they'll be against prayers to the saints or the intercessory role of saints, but they will you still see like churches where there's bricks or plaques dedicated to the people who donated money to this church, who founded the church, who helped the church grow. And so this is a kind of veneration. It's not the same, obviously, doctrinally, as the intercession of saints.
It's not like us Catholics are Orthodox, like the saints are of all importance, yes.
Yeah, they don't believe that they're involved in that particular way, but there's this sort of unconscious functional understanding that you should revere your fathers in the faith. Maybe there's a lot of people generally believe that you have shows like Touched by an Angel, which was mainly for a Protestant audience.
That was, my mother watched it though.
Yeah, I know, but it's sort of like people have intuitive sense that there are supernatural forces out there,
Oh,
and
baby, we're gonna give you a miracle today.
right. I mean,
Yeah.
it's there's this sort of kind of subconscious world that still unites a lot of people, even if some official statement or some official teaching clashes with people. I think there's a greater sense of spiritual unity among
Yeah.
practicing conservative Christians, more than
But
you would imagine.
but like has this sort of like emphatic anti-Catholicism sort of tempered with like the Hua of Babylon, as my people call it, the Huas,
Yeah.
is that sort of tempered, even like is it, what do they feel also of Mary as well? Because I know like extremely online Protestants, they make this big show of like going after Catholics and Orthodox about Mother Mary. Is that like not a real thing when it comes to like on the ground Protestant evangelical churches?
I think functionally, most people don't know or don't care. I think if they were to hear Catholic traditional prayers for Roman Catholics or Orthodox to Mary, that would weird them out extremely.
Really? Eh?
There'd been some movement. There's been some movement to try to bring Mary back as sort of an emphasis, but this is a much more like academic kind of like
Yeah.
online Protestant thing. Um,
But
but
Anglicans don't really have a problem. I mean, Anglicans very similar in that regard to Catholics, right?
they would generally be more tempered about, like, they wouldn't be as weirded out, but then you also should not general Protestant things, you should just pray to God, don't
Yeah.
ask the
Yeah.
saints, but yeah, kind of emphasizing the Virgin Mother Mary. I mean, most evangelicals, I think, just generally don't know anything. They like Mary because she's the mother of Jesus and she's important, and you had
She's a
contemporary
chaste
Christians.
woman figure that is a symbolic, like, yeah, I guess behavioral wise, especially for young women, that's probably a positive influence. But
Yeah. There was a contemporary Christian song called "Mary, Did You Know." Um,
oh yeah, that one.
and that was, I mean, and again, it's emphasizing Mary's faithfulness, but it doesn't have the same accent that you would get from, I'm not, from traditional Catholics, and I'm not trying to smooth everything out. Most evangelicals would probably make a distinction, between dead ritual and then lively guitar faith. And obviously, there
Mm.
are more evangelical Catholics that have guitar masses. So there's a kind of stereotype that Catholics don't really believe, or that they need to be converted. But there's not, most of them are not like virulently hostile. They don't think the Pope is the whore of Babylon. There's a couple of like the people who hand out like chick tracts, like
Yeah.
extreme Baptists, who will still advance that. But they would probably just think Catholics are kind of, and you would probably, your average evangelical would confuse Catholics, Lutherans, Orthodox, Anglicans, anyone that has vestments as basically being Catholic.
Oh no!
And so there's just a lack of knowledge on the ground level. But you can, if you're patient and intelligent, you can kind of walk through these issues and try to find common ground, and try to dispel some of these negative stereotypes. But it is funny. I mean, a lot of evangelicals will make a distinction between, oh, I'm a Christian, I'm not a Catholic. And I even know a guy who's Catholic who makes this distinction in the opposite way. He says, I'm a Catholic, I'm not Christian, which is kind of funny. And it's like,
Yeah.
okay, there's, sometimes there's a threshold where you know so little that I don't really know how to even talk to you right now.
Yeah.
But he's a good guy anyway.
But as Catholics, we do have that thing where we sort of like, we could sort of like pump our chest. It's like, oh, we run this thing, like
Yeah.
this thing of us. But even though everyone else gets incredibly mad, but yeah.
I think it is going to require patient work to try to just create a general sense of knowledge and a more peaceful disposition. But most, it's not like 1960 where, a lot of Protestants were suspicious of Jack Kennedy because he was a Catholic, and Kennedy had to go around telling everyone, he's like, I don't listen to the Pope. Don't worry. I'm having lots of affairs. I don't really follow the teachings of the church. No, I mean, he didn't say that, but he had to try to calm everyone's fears, and you didn't get that. I mean, people were opposed to Biden, not saying, oh, we have a Catholic being, running for president. No, they opposed him because he wanted to do babies and supported the Black Lives Matter and associated with
I
the
think
funding of the
that
police.
I think that people know that Biden's Catholicism is like non-existent. That the issue I think has gone beyond. Um, like JFK was from a time where most Northern Catholics pretty much you could expect that they were following the well, more or less.
And
And
they would at
name,
least give
yeah,
vocal confirmation. Yes, of course, we follow
yeah.
the teachings of the church, but that yeah, you don't have things where Biden just basically ignores the teaching, and then the Pope says it's okay.
Yeah, exactly. I think that with Biden, it's very much almost mimicking um, the predominantly Catholic politicians here in Canada. Where I mean, could you really say Justin Trudeau is a Catholic? No, you can't. Like honestly, I don't know why they shouldn't. I think they should excommunicate him, but that's my
Yeah.
own petty thing.
Well, in the United States, and maybe this is the case in Canada too, it's almost sort of a tradition for Irish Catholics to, you say, yes, of course I'm Catholic, but do you believe in God? No. Do you believe Jesus is God? No. Do you believe in the teachings of the church on contraception or sexuality
Oh
or
God,
morals?
no.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so this is this kind of generic disposition that someone like Biden still captures the kind of Catholic vote that associates with people like James Martin. And that,
Yeah. But it's funny though because among us WAPs though, like they voted for Trump.
yeah,
Because the Irish, I remember Rabbit had this thread about this, about the Irish, how they're like victim complex, like even though they're like fifth generation diaspora, that translates into like that embarrassing Dropkick Murphy speech, if you saw that one, where it's like, the appropriating like the macho-ness of the Irish for basic Bernie bro lib politics, right?
yeah, no, I know. And you see Sinn
Yeah.
Féin marching with a trans flag.
Yeah, but then Rabbit's like when you look at Italians though, in America, the diaspora still largely has a connection to people in Italy when they come over here. And also they're like, let's face it, casual Italian racism translated into voting for Trump. So it's
Yeah,
like the difference. I think culturally there's a big thing, but also when it comes to like the history of the Irish vote, when it comes to like labor unionism in America, that was sort of like a Germano-Irish project. And then, I mean, I could be wrong about it, right? But I know the Germanics started off the labor movement in America in places like Wisconsin, but then the Irish in those huge industrial cities in the north, it's like they were always the Irish Catholic. I mean, unfortunately, was always this inherent like Democrat voting base that
yeah,
nowadays has an identity crisis, in my opinion. If like you truly are Catholic, I think your allegiance to the Democrat Party has wavered. If you're a trad Cath or if you're someone that takes your Catholicism seriously, I mean,
yeah.
I could be wrong though. Maybe there
You
are
get
some
you get
rumors that
weird. I mean, it's not really representative on the ground of anybody because most, again, if you're Catholic, you're like, oh, that means I go to church on Christmas or something every 3 years.
most Catholic, I hate to say it, that is true. Yeah,
But
because yeah,
you do get the weird groups on social media or could identify as left Cath, and they try to take a more traditionalist view on
oh
doctrine. But
God, don't get me
and,
started.
it's terrible. And I met
Yeah.
I met a weird guy in real life one time who was like a trad like Episcopalian, and so he was adamant about maintaining the doctrines of like the Trinity and blah blah blah. But then he was completely gone over for gay marriage, and the trans stuff wasn't as big back then. But fine,
Man,
that's
weird.
good. So you get this like weird stuff where then there was this
You
weird
get Liz
group.
Brunegg. What you think of this? In post Nordic bodybuilder, Liz
Yeah,
Brunegg. Yeah, I know.
you get there's that weird K Hive trend about like, oh, we want Kamala and she's great, and like Biden, he's gonna bring back Catholicism to America. And I think you even
Yeah,
indulge in those memes about like, oh, we got to ban the Holy Father, like we're taking America back.
I saw there was one of these people in one of my group chats. There's like, Biden is Catholic, so therefore we have to respect him. I mean, what?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
I mean, because I'm used to it in Canada because of the huge Anglo. I mean, basically in Canada, you essentially have to come from the Laurentian elite to even become elected as prime minister. So we have quite a bit of Catholics who have become prime minister. And
Yeah.
it's so common to me, starting from Trudeau Sr., the stepfather, that
Yeah.
that like, you know, if you're a Catholic and you're a politician and you're part of the Liberal Party, because let's face it, his stepdaddy conned all of us European Catholic Orthodox immigrants into like voting for Gibbs forever. And
Yeah.
all these boomer Catholics and boomer Orthodox people, they like they know they don't sincerely believe in the faith, but it's just like, oh, I guess I'm Catholic. Like that's Justin Trudeau in the nutshell right there.
Yeah.
Is like, you know what I mean? Like, so I'm used to it, but I guess in America, I mean, it's almost getting to the point where the faith sort of doesn't matter. In some weird ways, I think Trump, even though he probably is very secular in his thinking, he like the fact that he gave a nod to religiosity, Christian religiosity in America, I think was sort of like a bringing back of like, in some weird ways, like let's say the early 2000s where Bush tried to sell the war by saying it's like a crusade and all this crap that David Frum was writing for him. But then after the Obama regime was like, I think, a very, very dark period for Christians in America everywhere when it comes to official POTUS level politics and Christianity.
Right.
You know, because he truly was, I think, the first, not the first black president, but the first secular, truly secular president, in my opinion. Could I be wrong about that? I mean, you're American, so you know better, but yeah.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because when Obama ran he was trying to win the primary, he took a fairly conservative tact on social
The black
issues.
church, yeah, the black churches,
against Hillary. So he downplayed gay marriage. He didn't think it was something that was going to be on the horizon any foreseeable future. He gave some tepid support for the Defense of Marriage Act. He made this huge deal about how he was a church attending Christian.
Yeah,
and that's when he brought up the Jeremiah Wright stuff. And
Jeremiah! Oh my God, that's ancient history.
Yeah, I know, right?
Yeah,
it's like a million years ago. So I don't think Obama. I mean, in practice, the reality, especially after the White House was lit up with the rainbow colors after the Obergefell decision,
he evolved. Remember, he evolved. Yeah,
yeah. That was I think that was the sort of pivot point in 2014. I think roughly. But Obama's sort of superficial Christianity is a fairly common tradition in 20th century presidents. Eisenhower didn't really have much of a faith. Kennedy kind of lipped his Catholic faith.
Yeah.
Nixon was a Quaker.
Bombing Vietnam. Yeah. Oh my God.
Reagan didn't really care. Like Reagan, like Eisenhower, picked a faith basically because the Presbyterian Church was pretty big in Washington D.C. It was sort of had a nice church, and it was pretty friendly with Washington elites. So that seemed like a good fit. Was he a Mason?
Reagan? Was he a Mason?
I don't know if Reagan was a Mason.
I know Nixon was a Mason, right?
No, I don't think he was either. The Masons didn't really have a whole lot of hold in the latter half of the 20th century. You didn't really need them to
you're right.
Crawl up. But the sort of tepid faith, like George W. Bush, everyone made a big deal about how he was an evangelical, but he was a Methodist in the same denomination as Hillary and Bill Clinton. They were both United Methodists. Bizarre, but this is just this sort of being able to lisp this sort of commitment to the faith. So Trump, everyone makes a big deal about, Trump's just lying. When they ask him what's his favorite book of the Bible, and he's just like, I like all of it. Yes, it's a stupid answer.
I like all of it.
But it's not really any different than any of these other people. And it's funny because Trump also associates with these kind of crazy Pentecostal people who will pray over him. And they'll like drink like Jewish Christian shawl over him and speak in tongues. And
I know that was a big thing among, like, for lack of a better term, like Wignat circles. Like they called him Zion Don, and like he was kissing the wall in Israel, and like
I mean, this is important for Pentecostals who think that the rapture is coming soon and that Jewish people are all going to come back to Christian faith. And there's like a weird interest in some charismatic evangelical circles about they will shun liturgical practices that Catholics or Orthodox or whoever uses, but they find like synagogue liturgical practices interesting. So they'll wear like a kippah and they'll blow a shofar and they'll celebrate Passover. It's weird. It's a sort of philo-Semitism, but it's out of this desire to convert. and that the people have this very special role to play in world history.
Yeah, I think they say that that's why Jews don't like these evangelical like Christians people, because they're like, oh, you people aren't honest about it. Like, in a way, yeah, but I know they make. I was reading this article on the significance of why there's no head, chief rabbi. I know not all recognize this, by the way, but there's no chief rabbi in America, and that's like you'd figure there would be, but
Right.
like the significance of that from both the Semitic perspective and the well, how should I say it? The non, the other
Okay, yeah.
that it's like significant why they wouldn't have a head rabbi, a chief rabbi. Either it's because it's some elaborate kayfabe, or because they don't feel like outside of these historically predominantly areas in Eastern Europe and in Israel and elsewhere that the head rabbi thing is not as significant. Because
and also
yeah,
the immigration of this kind of came with reflecting these European divisions. So
yeah,
you got like Brooklyn that's dominated, Crowning Heights is dominated by the Hasidic who's walking around with the curls and the
I see them, but I don't believe them. Yeah.
but then you have like your average American Jew. Like I don't believe God is like Star Wars the Force.
Yeah, they don't really believe in God. They don't really believe in God,
Right, and like going to a temple is like some cultural thing. I've
Yeah.
known people like this, and like like on the weird end, you have like female rabbis with wearing a kippah. Trying to like hammer this stuff out. You have to take almost a sociological approach if you want to, at least figure out what's going on. And you can't just go around looking at, well, what's your doctrinal statements? You're not going to find anything out about what real people are doing and how you're going to be able to deal with these facts without just turning yourself into like a weird separatist sect that eventually just bleeds to death because you have no cultural pull.
I think that's the criticism of Protestantism in general, especially in America, that you create these splinter cells and they just become like 20-person, like micro interest churches. And it's like, well, you know what I mean? Like even doctrinally, it's like, but at the same time, I think like the average Normo that votes Republican and probably has good values, like at the end of the day, you have to realize like these people, they're not like these autists online that talk like, what's the difference between Thomism and Duns Scotus, and what's the difference between the Sola Scriptura? Like they don't care. Like they love their faith. They love God and Jesus. They love guns. They love voting Republican. Like unironically, what Obama said, they cling to their guns and their Bible. Like it's like unironically like they cling to their guns and religion. Like that's. Like I have no problem. Like they're, you know what I mean? Like when we have greater evils to face.
Yeah,
like,
and even at that level, I mean, that accusation, they just keep splintering. But if you look at like the sort of thing that unites them, you'll see these parachurch organizations. So it operates outside of these denominational constrictions, and you'll have things for right or wrong. There's sort of a left evangelical intelligentsia that's not intelligent, but they try to drive things. But you'll have groups like in the 2000s, the Gospel Coalition, or there's this non-denominational evangelical group called Acts 29, and they struggled and they were fairly successful creating broader set of unity among different evangelical churches. So the idea that they keep fracturing into more denominations is true only if you accept that they keep reuniting over non-denominational infrastructures. So, you could go to a lot of evangelical churches and their pastors will, again, there's cultural divisions if you're out in rural nowhere versus if you're in a city evangelical church. But those cultural divisions aside, the chances of hearing basically the same kinds of topics, the way they pray the same way, they talk about things similarly, they'll exegete the Bible the same way, you will see this broader sense of cultural or spiritual unity that exists outside of these institutional divisions.
I think that makes more sense. Like I know that's sort of like a like trad cath, or especially like Orthodox talking point about like, oh well, they keep breaking up, they keep dividing, and it's like, yeah, they do, but I think like, I mean, Protestant America, I think, is going through its own identity crisis the way that Catholics, I mean, especially as Catholics, are going through, less so with the Orthodox. But I shouldn't say that. Maybe I'm just strong manning the Orthodox too much because like I'm black pilled over Francis. But you
Yeah.
know, it's like,
I mean, the Orthodox, the struggle they have is the same kind of predominance of ethnics. And so in the
yeah,
US, the vast majority on paper of Orthodox are in the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese. And, you know, you could see Orthodox struggling with their Archbishop, Elpiodorus, who is being censured by people in the Greek church back home in the old world. But you know, he's marching in Black Lives Matter stuff. He's giving kind of equivocal answers on rainbow stuff. And a lot of, you know, when you look at these polls, and I don't always trust, I rarely trust statistics, but you get a kind of
yeah,
a pulse. You see that Orthodox are generically identical to Democrat Party kind of talking points. And I think it reflects the sort of ethnic sense where, well, I'm Greek. I go to the Orthodox Church. The Orthodox Church teaches my kids Greek, teaches them how to appreciate a good spanakopita, and then that's about it. But particular faith in God or Christ or whoever or teachings of the church are downplayed. Now, I've heard in some corners that this is being reversed in some places where ethnics are
yeah,
dying, but it's still a tiny, tiny amount of people. The Orthodox Church in America makes up less than 1% of total, you know, believers in anything in the United States, and that's also counting all the ethnic Greeks. So it's good that there's health and they're growing, but it's also just be aware how small and kind of separated they are from the mainstream of American
yeah.
religion.
They don't really have, I think, the consciousness of when it comes to the American, uh, how should you say it? The American landscape of faith, they don't really capture the imagination the way that Catholics do. But I think that because Orthodoxy is still very alien to America, because Catholicism, we were here not as long as like the you know, who were the first ones, the Puritans, the Anabaptists, like,
Yeah, yeah, New
but we
England. But I
came
mean,
along like
don't,
pretty
don't
soon
sell
after.
your don't sell yourself short because yeah, Maryland was the Baltimore family were Catholics.
Yeah,
Obviously,
yeah,
English Catholicism was always an extreme minority in America, but yeah, very early on with Irish and immigration, you get this large amount of Catholics, and that's why yeah, it has this power over cultural imagination. Where any
yeah.
movie there's like a spooky supernatural element. It's
Get a
not
Catholic
like
priest, an
it's not
exorcist.
Pastor Bob from the Baptist church who's dealing with it. It's almost always, yeah, you know, Father James, Father Michael, and he comes over and he's exercising some
Father
girl.
McGiverney, yeah.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Then us Italians came like after that a little bit. So it yeah, I think that, or I mean the good thing though is that the converts to Orthodoxy in America are very traditionalist. I know what's that one church? It's sort of like united thing. I know Prude is a member of it. That is, I think they were recognized as legitimate by Russia, the patriarchy in Russia. Um, I forget, like the one in the South. What's the big one in the South?
Was it Rotor?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That one. Yeah, yeah. They were recognized by the patriarch in Moscow. I think. I could be wrong about that, but
Yeah, I mean, there's several different churches that because they all had to do with the relationship between the official Orthodox Church that the Soviet government controlled, and then there was the underground Orthodox Church, and you had all
yeah,
this Russian diaspora, and
the real one. Yeah,
yeah, which one do you affiliate with, and then there were different diasporas that set up their own church. Like, so I mean, I can't litigate that,
yeah.
but it's, you know, they're all
Well, in
kind of coming
Canada, we
together.
have this too because, like, we have a huge blue yellow diaspora in Canada. We have the
Yeah,
biggest blue yellow diaspora. So the blue yellow church, of course, is like, I mean, they have to, obviously, they have to support their own. So, like, because Catholics basically, for the longest time in Canada, were just equated with the Francophone side of Canada, even though they came from Ireland or they came from Italy. They still, like, that was like, there are a huge amount of Italians in Montreal. for a reason, because that's where all the churches were. And Anglophone Canada was always centrally Anglican, some other Presbyterian or whatever, but mostly like vast majority for a time anyways Anglican. But then of course I know that Americanized churches have made their way up here. Then you have like absolutely ridiculous like United Church, which is
Yeah.
basically United Leftist Social Club of Canada. That's what it is. It's not.
Yeah,
Really...
it's a way to religiously identify as an atheist.
Exactly. You know about this. You know about like Tom Harpoo, who wrote the book With or Without God. I'm an atheist, but yet I'm a bishop or whatever they call it.
This sort of thing floated around most mainline Protestants, and there were kind of Catholic versions of this, but it never received the same institutional imprimatur.
No, we cleared them out. We cleared them out. Do you have that same problem though in like these Protestant denominations in America, where like I know the very, very liberal Baptist churches or whatever, they do have you basically have, you could say, nominal atheists who are taking up leadership positions. Is that true, or is that just
in the United States, it all originates out of the modernist fundamentalist controversy, and the fundamentalists lost all the major institutional battles for the most part. So you have this fracture. So that's why you'll go to Princeton, and Princeton used to be this hotbed of like solid Presbyterian Reformed theology in the 19th century.
Yeah, the Atlantic, like Blue Nose. Yeah.
Like it's now they're just it's just a mainline thing. So you can divide Protestants basically on the spectrum of evangelical or mainline, and evangelical runs a pretty far gamut. It includes everything from like Southern Baptist and Assemblies of God Pentecostals on the one hand, and then including groups like the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, which uses crosses and candles, and some of them even use incense, but they're in robes and clerical collars and so on. But the kind of evangelical ethos is that, again, to summarize what you were saying, is guns and Bible and Jesus. And that kind of unites them, at least in some kind of general sense, even though Lutherans and Baptists Baptists will say Lutherans are basically Catholics. Lutherans will say Baptists are just stupid heretics. But in reality, with most normal people who vote Republican, live in the suburbs, whatever, they don't really think about this. And that kind of broader unity on a cultural, social, and doctrinal level reflects among all evangelicals. And on the other hand, you have the mainline Protestants, whether they're Episcopalians or the mainline Presbyterian Church, the mainline Baptist Church, or mainline Methodist Church. Most Black Baptist churches, almost all of them, Black religion is entirely mainline, and so that's where you get transgender pastors, gay bishops.
I wanted to ask you about that, like where I've heard the Black churches are essentially just activist organizations. Then you have like some kind of like mainstream self-help people, like what's the one Pastor Manning bashes, the best friend of Dr. Phil, what's his name? TD Jakes, like he's doing the rent money dance in the church for Pastor Manning.
I mean, you get that, but these are like somewhat in the evangelical sphere, because
they're charismatic churches, in other words.
Yeah, they pitch themselves as multiracial, and so you'll see a lot of these like big ticket, these people are like basically criminals, but these big ticket like mega church pastors, like T. Jakes or Creflo Dollar. I used to be interested.
Creflo Dollar, he sounds like a pimp. I remember Pastor Manning was like, Creflo Dollar, that sounds like a pimp's name.
That's right. I mean, it's so absurd when you look at it from the outside. But like Joel Osteen and these people, they pride themselves.
Joel Osteen's the white equivalent of like that type of charismatic holy roller, like grifter. Like,
but they pride themselves on being colorblind. They don't emphasize the sort of racial solidarity that you would see traditionally in the Black church, which is basically just since the 50s and 60s. It's just the sort of decaying extension of the civil rights movement.
Yeah. Did you know a lot of Blacks that came up here in Canada because of the railroad, they converted to Catholicism in Ontario? Did you know
That's
that?
interesting. No, I didn't know that.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of Black Catholics here in Canada. They're the Haitians, of course. I think they're why I mean they're Catholic, but they got the
Yeah,
weirdo.
the voodoo.
Yeah, it's kind of like Mexicans with San Muerto. Like they have their own equivalent of like Hutu churches that like I mean by the time they come to Canada, it doesn't really matter. But like you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like
yeah, yeah.
but the black churches in America, I know that during the Obama years, for obvious reasons, it was like emphasized as like they become activist organizations, but also like they, yeah, like the Obama's pastor, what was his name?
Jeremiah Wright.
Jeremiah Wright. Like that was a huge. I remember. I just like have a dormant memory of like listening to Rush Limbaugh or like Michael Savage talking
Yeah.
about Jeremiah
But,
Wright.
you know,
Like,
it's funny though because Jeremiah Wright was not in a black church. He was in the United Church of Christ, which is
yeah,
this union group of these German Reformed churches. And so he's sort of like mainline Protestant churches. Again, they like take great pride in tokenism, where they're like they want to promote as many minorities as possible. So you have this very mild mannered liberal Protestant denomination with this black pastor who's getting up screaming about "God damn America." White people.
beast. Yeah. But he
Uh,
didn't. But then he didn't condemn America the way that like Pat Robertson condemned America
no,
after
no,
9/11.
no, no.
It was
Like,
more like goddamn America because of racism. Like that's.
yeah.
But I wanted to ask you like, yeah, two questions. Then we'll move on to Agamben. Number one is, where do you fit doctrinally? Do you believe in like sola scriptura, or like what is your thing? Or I don't know if Anglicans believe in that. Like,
Okay.
what? Yeah, go ahead. Go
So
ahead. What is your thing? Yeah.
I mean, the thing that
Because you alluded to it on Twitter, I'm just not very clear on the what your
yeah,
distinctions are. Yeah, yeah,
I no, I'm kind of a standard Protestant in that way that in the idea, and I wrote an article about this, trying to explain what is and what isn't sola scriptura, because a lot of the way it developed over time in these debates and these polemics in the 17th century became more and more radical.
yeah.
Um, but the idea, the core idea of sola scriptura is that you cannot bind someone's conscience in terms of you're going to hell if you don't believe this, unless you
Oh,
can
I see. I
demonstrate
see.
it from Scripture. So the early Protestant confessions did not prohibit certain doctrines. They just did not. You could not make them mandatory. So you could not
Right.
say that I don't think you should pray to the saints. I don't know if they hear me or not. There's no reason in Scripture to believe that they can hear me when I talk to them if they're not physically present. So I don't feel comfortable doing that. And you cannot condemn me and say, this is the teaching of the church. If you deny this, you're denying the church. You're going to go to hell. You can't
Right.
you can't tell me that. That's the basic original point. Is that whatever you were trying to demonstrate and prove, you have to first prove it out of Scripture, and then
Right.
other authorities, right? The early Protestants did not deny the authority of the church fathers. They just used them in a somewhat different way.
I know
Uh,
Lutherans are much more sympathetic to the early church fathers than
yeah,
yeah.
it kind of you see this sort of radicalization process take place both among Catholics and Protestants, where Catholics, you had early, people who were fighting against Luther, people like Cardinal Cajetan, that
Yeah.
basically agreed that Luther's points on a lot of things were correct. However, that does not give him the justification to separate from the church or to
Yes. Yeah.
antagonize the hierarchy. And of
100%.
course, Luther was like, "Well, you yourself." Um,
Yeah.
but you get that kind of middle ground position disappears very quickly, and by the Council of Trent, things that had not
Yeah.
been decided upon, now it was clear, right? The questions about the Deuterocanon is of equal authority with the rest of Scripture. That was done away with. Yes, it is now equal authority. Catholics contemplating sola fide, that was swept away. Right now, it's an error to be condemned.
Yeah, yeah. And what do you think? Because this is what I believe. Like the pretty standard Catholic answer would be that we need the wisdom of those other things to inform us within the doctrines of the church. So what do you say to that? Like I mean, listen, people. I think it was because of follow the rules. People thrusted me into this position of being an apologist, but really, I'm more. I know what I believe, even though I'm like open minded enough to like hear an argument, you know. So
Right.
I'm not like I'm not like as theologically informed as say classic theist or a lot of my other friends who are trad Catholic. But my argument is that it makes sense to me as a Catholic that these other things, the wisdom of the saints, the wisdom of the various councils throughout history,
Right.
you know. So what would you say though, as a Protestant, to those arguments that I mean, if I was like say very like you know, autist trad about it, I would be like grilling you on it. But yeah, but
But,
say I'm like one of these people, say I'm grilling you. What would you make of these arguments as a Protestant?
Well, first, it's just trying to clarify what the difference was. So Protestants didn't deny the authority of councils
Yeah.
or your church fathers. They only denied that they were without error. And the main division
Oh,
between
I see that they're given like an authority in which they could not be with error. Like
yeah,
and like
and
which is in Catholicism, that's what we believe. Like the church fathers, the doctrine, it's like it's airtight. You know what I mean? Like
yeah,
that. Like by the time you get to the Council of Trent, yeah,
it's a collective wisdom. So, you know, because
yeah.
early Protestants and even, you know, a Catholic apologist like Newman recognizes is that the fathers disagree with each other, or earlier fathers can seem to be saying something that's an error that later council corrected.
Yeah, exactly. So it's the collective chain of wisdom that is
Yeah,
given authority by the church. So those disagreements, well, the faith of the church is that hopefully through grace, those arguments will be will be meted out eventually. Don't worry.
yeah, right.
It very much is like a Mediterranean thing. No, don't worry about it. It's like
Right.
it'll all come together eventually. Yeah.
But that, I mean, that Newman approach is very different. In the
Yeah.
Reformation era, the argument that the Catholic Church put forward was uh, Protestants would say Scripture is the highest authority. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
Roman Catholics would have argued that Scripture is the highest authority, but there's another authority that's equal with it, which is the unwritten tradition. And they
Yes.
mean that literally. They don't mean unwritten tradition, but we can go find it in the fathers. They mean this is what the church has always believed, even if no one has written about it. And so when a Protestant would say, well, we don't see this kind of imperial papacy in the early church, or we don't see cardinals in the early church. We do not see purgatory or the treasury of merit in the early church, let alone scripture.
Yeah.
The Roman Catholic argument is that no, even if no one had written about it, the truth of these things was always preserved in the teaching authority of the church, and that is of equal authority with scripture itself. So just because there isn't a pope does, you know, that you can see,
Yeah.
it doesn't mean that that's not the actual teaching of the church. And so the emphasis, you know, the rebuttal Protestants would offer would be, okay, well, how are we supposed to know what this is? How is this not just fiat teaching, right? What is the teaching of the church? Well, it's whatever we teach right now. Could you err? And Luther's whole point early on was, well, if you look at different papal statements, they contradict one another. So which one do you believe? How do you judge between councils that contradict each other, or papal statements? And he would say, well, you would have to submit it to scripture. And of course, Catholics would say, no, you know, it's basically not exactly a presentism, but there was a sort of awkwardness about this where these kinds of difficulties have to be resolved. They don't contradict each other, but maybe I don't know how to resolve it, but we just trust that it doesn't.
And in the future, there would be a council, and it's like maybe eventually.
Yeah, maybe something else would iron it out. But the reason I hear the sola scriptura is it just sort of puts the emphasis on the Bible as this, at least as sort of an authority, and it doesn't mean the Bible is necessarily self-interpreting, which is one common argument. Tradcasts would say, well, like, the Bible is sort of it's just a text. You have to read it. But but I'm not a postmodernist in the sense that all texts are just completely fluid and you can make something of it, whatever you want.
I want to talk about postmodern theology a little bit after. But sorry, I cut you off. Go ahead.
And so I find that doctrine of sola scriptura, at least in the sense of scripture, is the ultimate authority. Not scripture is the only deposit of truth. Not that
And now you're the who of Babylon if you
yeah,
agree that there's other authority. Yeah.
yeah.
And you're gonna bring about the end times and that, you know, yeah.
I think some Catholic teaching is in error, but I don't think that unchurches them or unchristians them, and it's just
What
something to continue to debate.
what teaching do you think is in error the most? Like, what if you had to give like an answer? Like, do you think that divine simplicity is in error? What
Oh
is
no,
your
it would be mainly sort of the prerogatives that the papacy has. I think that's the one of the
like the authority of the papacy, in other words?
yeah. And so I mean, like it's interesting. There were kind of efforts at finding common ground and friendship between the Church of England and
Yeah, yeah.
Russian and Greek Orthodox, because again, it was this concern that the papacy was removing the prerogatives of bishops who had this teaching authority, and that they were kind of being subjected to a universal force. Now, of course, that's the appeal for some Catholics. Here's the one center, the one guy who can solve this. You don't have, you know,
100%.
you don't have these bickerings between bishops within some college. But I think the history has shown that ultramontanism and increasing centralization has done a lot of damage. And of course, today tradcaths are not going to point to the Pope as much. Maybe they'll hope that there's a future Pope, but they're going to emphasize faithful bishops or faithful priests who refuse to change from the historic faith.
Yeah, and I think the argument would be that this isn't the first time this has happened. I mean, there's always been terrible popes throughout history that have done terrible things, but doctrinally, like for example, the worst examples, they tend not to make a lot of like papal decrees that have lasting bearing on actual theology. So that's like in some ways maybe maybe that's grace in itself, that the
Yeah.
most terrible popes, they sort of don't care about actual theology. The worst would be, I think, if Francis had a few more IQ points. That would be terrible. I think that if he had the IQ of Ratzinger, it's all over now. I think, it's so over.
Yeah.
But
I mean, the challenge
hopefully,
that Catholics have is that doctrine isn't just strict theology; it's also social and ethical teaching. And it
yes,
seems
yeah,
that Francis is reversing the Church's position on the death penalty, and a lot of
he
people
is,
are
but he
struggling.
isn't. It's like
Yeah.
he's a chaos factor. That's the big problem, in my
Well,
opinion.
well, yeah. I mean, so there was a book that somebody recommended. I think it's called The Dictator Pope, but it's saying that Francis's political or his ecclesiastical philosophy is Peronism. He's this radical centrist that alienates both sides
Yes,
constantly to
yeah,
sort of
yeah.
force them under his thumb. And I think that's a good way, because he'll say one thing about he'll say like, oh, we need to respect sort of the rights of gays and atheists, and this alienates a lot of conservative and traditional
But then
people.
he says like maybe it's good if you have children and you get
Yeah,
married.
yeah,
And
yeah.
yeah,
And like he'll even do a double move where he'll say all these traditional priests, they're just a bunch of like closeted homos who want to dress up in frilly dresses. Like alienates both sides at the same time.
yeah, yeah. Then like he'll go hard on like SSPX or
Right,
well,
right.
I mean,
So I mean, I have hope.
Bishop Lefebvre did nothing wrong, by the way.
Yeah,
But
I have a lot of respect for traditional Catholics, even if I have doctrinal disagreements. And
yeah,
I
I
think
think like to me, it's like attributing too much Machiavellian intent to Pope Francis. But yeah, go ahead.
I was
Sorry.
just saying, I like to think that there is, hopefully, there could be a greater kind of common ground between at least more conservative Anglicans, Orthodox, and traditional Catholics about the importance of a strong episcopacy. That the integrity of a diocese cannot be smashed to pieces by some faraway influence.
Yeah, I think that the problem, I've said this before on the show, is that you have to realize that America has a strong undertow of Catholicism, but America itself will always be a Protestant nation. It'll
Yeah,
always have that spirit and that DNA design within it. And I think if you had like non-pause churches that were strong and could guide people towards faith, as a Catholic, I mean, it's not the best, obviously, but it's still like something. It's still like, I think like an actual Protestant America would probably be, I mean, apart from like the whole like unhinged anti-Catholicism found in certain certain hooded organizations, if you know what I mean. You know,
Yeah.
apart from that, I think like
I mean, that's definitely part of the tradition, though.
yeah.
You know, what it meant to be Protestant was you weren't like a French Catholic who was just kissing bones and crawling before statues and all these sorts of stereotypes. And then, you know, there's some academic literature I think is kind of amusing, written by obviously the, you know, kind of generic leftists, but they've you know, it's most of them are much more sympathetic to Catholics, oddly enough, because it's whatever to tear down America. So the reigning structure of America is the sort of kind of widespread Protestant unity. But anyway, you'd have these kind of lurid accounts in the early 19th century where the Protestants are like, what are they doing in that nunnery? They got all those beads, and there's a bunch of women there. And you know, and then you have these like kind of lesbian romance stories.
Yeah,
like,
I was talking about this to a friend. I was talking about this to a friend yesterday. She said like about like that's what turned her off from Paglia, is that the whole like feminist reaffirmation of the nunnery being like this lesbian paradise because it's like a matriarchy.
Yeah, exactly. Right. You know, if you're a Catholic, you have to smash that. You can't just be, oh yeah, see, look, it's a defensive Catholic. You have to be very careful about your friends, the kinds of arguments you accept.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Like, I think like, at least for the time being, like if Protestants were serious about their faith, it's better than like a Protestantized America that's actually serious about its faith is probably better than like, you know, what we have nowadays. I think like for Catholics anyways, like that's my argument. I think like it's almost like what you were saying. Because another thing that comes to mind is like the argument that during Trump, that you probably like, I mean, I'm assuming that they're all just like lib infiltrators, but you know the argument they made when Trump was inaugurated, that oh my god, how dare these evangelicals, they soiled themselves by voting for Trump, who's mean and says bad words. And like what was that deal? Like the vast majority of evangelicals in America voted for Trump, if I'm assuming. And it's like,
and even though like, so this is another trend that's been long going, is that there were a lot of evangelicals who wrung their hands, sort of more kind of the talking head media types. So people like Russell Moore, who's completely discredited himself because George W. Bush evangelical. But they're like, oh, I can't, you know, again, they're self-criticism. But it is a trend beginning. Evangelicalism, in the sense that we know it today, emerged out of the 40s and 50s, and it was fundamentalists who wanted to go a little bit easy. They wanted to kind of soften the differences, or a lot of fundamentalists have sort of exiled themselves from politics, is that this is inextricably corrupt. You have this mainline liberal elite that are controlling everything. There's no point to even bother with this. And evangelicals wanted to come back, but they wanted to sort of soften their blows to try to seem more reasonable. And this is a fairly practical strategy. You kind of moderate so that you can filter back into mainstream, filter back into the mainstream and try to control the direction of politics and culture. But this can easily be that image that Carl Schmitt describes of his fellow conservatives, or the guys who are at the back of the ox cart who just dig their feet into the ground. And yes, they slow the cart down a little bit, but they're just being moved progressively in the direction that the cart's moving. So
they're the typical normie conservatives, in other
words. And so you are not going to, if all you try to do is moderate, and moderate's not a tactic, but it becomes a spirit, it becomes a way of life. You know, this is the same kind of criticism of the Kirkian conservative movement. If all it is an affect and an aesthetic, a conservative is somebody who wants to preserve tradition. Well, if you don't have any tradition worth preserving, then you can't have a conservative movement. You're just sort of 10 years behind, and you're the rear guard cleaning up the enemies of the regime. And I think that's basically, you know, you have hand-wringing from Catholics and evangelicals and all sorts of types that are trying to reflect this moderated conservatism.
And this goes back to what you were writing in one of your first articles that I read, was the sort of political history in America, what the future of American politics would be like, which I wanted to ask you about before we get into the hardcore stuff with Agamben, is do you think that the George Bushian, like, compassionate conservative nonsense, like, that was a reflection of, like, Protestant evangelical America having this sort of like identity crisis and then finding a way to mediate, like, okay, yes, we're basically just Jannies for their, like, the oncoming liberal regime, but it's like we realize that we're basically just a lame duck and that we're just the cleanup crew.
Well, I
Was
mean,
that, yeah,
I think the people who handled Bush, people like From, are
yeah.
definitely those types. But George Bush was marketed as this very, I mean, obviously he's from the Bush family, this Bush clan that's like old school WASP nobility.
They're not Texan. They come from Kellywomport,
Yeah,
Maine, as Alex Jones would. Yeah, yeah.
right.
Back in the day, said.
But they created this image of George W. Bush, including his sort of somewhat fictitious conversion story involving Billy Graham, because
Oh yeah, I wonder how much lines he did when he came up with that story.
yeah. Well, I think the core truth of the conversion story was that George Bush realized, like, I'm a drug addict and an alcoholic. I need to stop, or my life is going to fall apart. But
And it
then
was
kind
to
of
appeal to like the youth brigade, Protestant stuff.
right,
Like
with
it,
all of this
yeah.
stuff, the marketing appealed to real Americans who had this faint tradition of, well, America shouldn't be a world cop. America needs to worry about American things. We need to take care of our families. And, you know, in retrospect, it's kind of insane to think and realize that Al Gore was the hawk. Al Gore was like, we
Oh
need
my
more
god.
interventions. We need more invasions. We need to protect the world. And George Bush was the one who ran on, you know, maybe America doesn't need to be the world cop and maybe we should just take care of ourselves. But
Didn't
in
he say,
hindsight,
like, I didn't want to be like my daddy? Like, I don't want to be like Herbert Walker who went and bombed Iraq and Kuwait. Like,
I mean, they
yeah,
like kind of stage managed this, but you know, he was in truth, and he was surrounded by a lot of his dad's men, besides the neocon faction.
yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah, he was going to just be the same kind of liberal internationalist. But you gloss it slightly differently, so all the heartland Americans who still remember that this tradition of, you know, somewhat isolationism, you know, not idealist in foreign policy, trying to,
Paleoconservatism in America.
yeah. So Bush was sort of the, you know, it's like what they teach you in like sales and stuff. It's like, how do you sell like the worst product, but you don't alienate the customer enough that they'll bother switching. Like, we'll try to figure out the least palatable but still palatable option so we can get maximal benefits and we can still attract the average voter, who, you know, it's either Bush or, you know, the guy who invented the internet who wants to like completely eradicate Eastern Europe.
Oh yeah, we need to bomb more Serbians. That was his
Yeah,
policy.
yeah.
Yeah, we need to bomb more Serbians. Basically, break up Russia. Like that's, but you know what? That's crazy. Like, people forget this stuff. But do you think that, like, I know that they say that Terry Schiavo was like a godsend for Bush when it came to the evangelical vote, because now he could like take something that was safe and easy but distracted from what he was actually doing. And it was like this grandstanding of like, you know, if you focus on Terry Schiavo, then you could focus on like, then you won't have to focus on the war in Iraq or like liberal internationalism.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know that was like a big thing that people said. But yeah, that is crazy. That's sort of like an unwritten history. But like your article was talking about how like faith also transformed in America. And would you say by the Bush era, like the whole like Reaganite like thing among Protestants, that was sort of gone, that like the paleocons were like, it was over, it was all over now? Like, and
I mean,
like,
it was just, it's just kind of being ground down progressively. So I mean, you know, I made a comment about this where you even like 40 years ago or 30 years ago, the idea where you have people driving around with Joe Biden on their truck and they're conservatives. This was like quintessential dirtbag left 1960s street theater stuff, and this was
yeah,
very unpalatable to most Americans, of public swearing. Like, you know, you swear in your house alone, but you don't go outside and like broadcast it on your car. This was very like classless, trashy stuff.
yeah, that was
But
very, yeah, yeah.
now this has just sort of become normalized, and I don't, you know, it's hard to say, like, looking back, exactly where everything is going or what kind of radical stop or shift or adjustment. But you know, Paul Gottfried's recent book, The Anti-Fascism History of a Crusade, he makes this point. It's like, what we call conservatives today were like 90s kind of labor Democrats who were somewhat socially conservative, worried about jobs. And this was sort of unpalatable to paleocons because it goes much deeper than that, or cultural issues. Yeah. But 30 years later, this is like, what is the paleocon movement?
It's this. It's like, it's let's go. It's you know, like the land shark. Land shark. He shared the one patch where it's like the Punisher symbol, like, you know, that boomer, like Ed Hardy Punisher skull aesthetic, and it said like let's F Brandon. It's like that sort of sexual humiliation of Brandon. It's like he's like, I can't believe I find this so funny. I remember like
and it's just like, it's kind of goofy, vulgar stuff, but you just, you know, again, if conservatism is just this affect and this aesthetic of, well, we got to like hold what we value, and you think, what is that? Like, you know, kind of like trashy redneck stuff. I mean, no offense to, you know, I like that kind of stuff. It's it's like aesthetic, but you know, that's not something foundational. It's sort of kitschy, and so it's just trying to figure out. I mean, this is
Walmart kitsch, in other words.
I think it's just, this requires a lot of soul searching. It doesn't mean you don't make pragmatic decisions in the present about voting or affiliating with one candidate or another, but it's just trying to become self-aware so you don't get sucked into some silly mania where you end up just repeating and regurgitating, which I see a lot of, like the people who wring their hands about Trump, and they would rather have, you know, whatever, Greg Abbott or Brian Kemp or DeSantis. You know, I think a lot of them will just sort of meme themselves into just repeating the same foolish decisions Bush era intellectual conservatives did. And
National Review conservatives.
I mean, they just sort of like, I'm sure Pat Buchanan, you know, ultimately at the end of the day, I'm sure he was happy that Bush won the election against Al Gore, but then you're kind of like, you're stuck. What do you do? And this kind of deep soul searching is still necessary for a lot of people. So you don't just keep getting memed into supporting the generic regime politics. I mean, it comes down like, okay, fine, maybe you don't want Lula, and Bolsonaro was kind of cool in Brazil, but you know, he's out there, he says Slava Ukraini, and you know, he does the same like shtick, and I don't know.
Yeah, and I don't like what he's doing to the rainforest. That's another thing.
Yeah. But you know, you just have to, again, you make pragmatic decisions, but you don't have to meme yourself into an ideology.
Well, I think like I know my friend Constantine Martelli of the War Report podcast, him and Goran, my very good friend, they were talking about, I'm actually recording with them tonight. They were talking about the situation with Mama Malone, and sort of blackpilled me on her. Because I said positive things on my podcast last week. But it's like he came up with such a great term. It describes like the European conservative, like their equivalent of conservatism, like to a T. He called them gladio conservatives, where well, they'll basically fight for like they'll fight against the enemies of like the American regime, the global American empire, but it's like they'll have a conservative spin on it, like old school anti-communism or like, you know, stuff like that. Like gladio conservatism in Europe is such, like, I hate to say it, but a lot of like these far right like identity groups are also becoming gladio conservatives. I mean,
that's like Richard Spencer with the Ukraine flag. That's that's what you need to know.
The Polish, they're like the ultimate gladio conservatives now because of their I mean, granted, justified and warranted like ancestral hatred of Russia. So
they make these pragmatic decisions themselves, but this is not, you know, I try to focus on sort of the consequential positions. So like that was why the Corona era and then still ongoing ricochets and whiplashes. This was a very important moment because I did not want to be faced with these choices, and so you know, I'd be willing to basically support anyone who would fight against it. And so that was like a fairly good metric. You know, again, this is kind of, I've been reading Agamben in the past, but this sort of turned me back and thinking like I should focus a little bit more on this because you know, you have Maloney saying, like, you know, talking about the good of required mandates throughout Europe. Back in 2019, she's associated with these sort of global young leader development groups. And so, yeah, like, okay, you can give it a nice gloss where it's about G.K. Chesterton and Lord of the Rings, but they're going to still jab me.
Yeah. Well, she has anime about her, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, she has a waifu. Yeah. But also,
yeah.
like, she talks about the family and, like, again, this is very, like, Gladio conservative type of, like.
So you know, it's about getting down to brass tacks, and so that's the thing. Like the Reagan era was one of the. I love the '80s aesthetically, but the Reagan era was one of the worst because people meme themselves, both right wing and left wing, to think Reagan was this. He's this great free trader. He's like freeing the economy from domestic socialism with his neoliberal politics. But
he threw out the welfare queen stuff. Like,
yeah, I mean, and that was a lot of that. Like, he could like play with that rhetoric, and I got a lot of Americans to support that, and rightly so. But when it comes down to it, you know, he gave a eulogy for Walter Reuther of the United Auto Workers. He was about improving tariffs to kind of deal with Japan. There's massive government spending on military projects. You know,
he let Rover live.
Basically. Yeah. There's also, I mean, he was I forget who the author was, but it's called No Rightward Turn. Somebody turned it on to me on Twitter. I think it was like Rodden or Carlsbad maybe or somebody. But you know, it was this sense of like even the right wing candidates, they are just sort of we'll just slow down the acceleration.
Yeah.
And then you know both right and left will believe the sort of mythos around the person, whereas Reagan was really just kind of a somewhat conservative New Deal Democrat. That's always what he's been.
You know, there was this theory I heard that it actually blew my mind because I could see this because like my old man, like he lived through this time, right? That Brian Mulroney was essentially just like Reagan with the mask off, more or less, like not caring about any social issues, just getting NAFTA approved. Like Brian Mulroney, he like has this image of like, oh, I like really did the hard decisions when like Trudeau screwed everything up economically. So I had to make the hard decisions. But then it's like really Brian Mulroney is like the essence of like the American neoliberal in the Canadian context is like conservative, more or
right.
less.
I mean, it's a demonstration that you don't even need to pander. You don't have to create an advertising campaign. You can just ram it through.
Yeah. And then in the 90s, the reform happened and yeah. But yeah, that's been great, man. You know, we went so long on it because I'm curious about. Before you get into a comment, like the last question, I promise is the last question, but it's about your article though. Where do you see the future of the right wing in America? Where do you see? I asked this question last night. I asked, do you see a possibility of the political fracturing in America translating to basically one-term presidents from here on out? Or, you know, presidents that maybe don't stay their full term. Like, do you think that's a possibility? But also, where do you see like the future of, let's say, the Republican Party in America after Trump, or if Trump's going to come back? Or what do you see as like the dissident right position in America? Which, I mean, I don't want a black pill, but like, what is your whole take? Like, in the light of your article, you're writing about the history and the future of like reaction in America.
I mean, I you know, take this all with a grain of salt. I on my podcast, which is I did like an hour and a half where people were interested in my own political biography, the sort of changes where I cut my teeth, how I sort of adapted and adjusted, and you know, spiritually, all throughout from you know first major appearance in 2008 till now, I've always found myself attracted to Ron Paul and. You know, a lot of people mention the sort of like libertarian, the right wing dissident pipeline. People, you know, kind of disturbed by this regime. However, I'm also worried just about falling for meme politics. Now, I know a lot of people are hostile because it's association with sort of the Kantbot logo axis of
the Widenacons.
Yeah. The concern about Peter Thiel and the Palantir and all this stuff and taking Thiel bucks and things like that.
By the way, I always say this every podcast. If Peter Thiel wants to give me money and give me that chubby blonde. Well, she's married actually, but if he wants to give me an equivalent chubby chick, please, Peter Thiel, I will be your biggest soldier. Please give me money. Give me a flat in Florida.
I like the joke with people. It's like back in the day in like classic American politics, like you would get votes, and voter fraud was basically bribery. Somebody would give you $20 or like a turkey or something, and you're like, vote for me. And you're like, that's better than like Bernie Sanders making another ad asking me for $15. Like, what happened to back in the day when politicians used to bribe me? Why do I have to pay for them?
You know, back in the day, if you wanted to be a right-wing dissident, you had to go to like, you know, lobbyist Goy Blatstein acts and like whatever, like, you know.
But basically, the Teal network, I'm very suspicious of, because there was this is sort of a symbol for me. It's sort of a synecdoche for a much wider concern, which ties into Agamben somewhat. But there was a Freedom of Information Act request for a PowerPoint that the CIA did on China, and the main concern that the CIA had about China was it wasn't this ideological opposition. They were just worried in terms of geopolitical difference that China was going to technologically leapfrog the United States. And the reason they thought China could do this was because they lacked all of these things that slowed down change. So the Chinese don't have any real tradition of paper money. They don't have a tradition of individual ownership of homes and cars. All of this stuff had been uprooted and radically destroyed over the 20th century. So when it comes to changing and adjusting for its working population, its managers, and all this stuff, new things can happen much quicker because nobody has any attachments. Whereas,
very interesting. Wow.
You have these like millennials and Zoomers who are perfectly fine using like Apple Watches and scan cards, and maybe I'll get like a digital ID chip installed in my wrist so that it makes banking and transactions easier. But most of your boomer kind of grandpa or older mom or dad, they're still hostile to this idea of like, I don't want to give up my money, I don't want to give up my home, I don't want to give up my truck. Even though I think it's exaggerated how much power the World Economic Forum has and how much intelligence they had, I do think that there is this concerted effort to perfect this social democracy model, and the only way you can do that is by having kind of very controlled but violent social change, where you are destroying people's ability to find themselves rooted. So the expectation that you go work for a gig economy job, that you bounce from apartment to apartment.
You go work for Giga Chat. Giga Chat Industries,
but the that'd be a good
perfecting the Winthrop-ian science in the Giga Chat Industries,
just convert, like, make a parallel institution to Uber Eats, but it's Giga Chad.
And they're giving you Tran in every delivery.
But this is something that everyone is interested in, and I think the main political divide is between more internationalists who want to maintain the sort of global system that finally came to a climax in the 90s, and those who think that it's unsustainable and they want to break it down into a more national or regional focus, which I think is what the Teal network believes in. And this is why they adapt more nationalist kind of rhetoric. It's not all insincere. I do think there is a much smaller focus on maintaining global American power. You have to sort of slough off this some of this infrastructure, all these army bases everywhere, canceling out the inessential ones. But for me, this is just a slightly different tactical approach to the problem. And I don't, I get all those Ron Paul memes, the Doom Paul memes of like, it's over.
Happening.
Yeah, it's happening.
All you had to do was listen. You could have prevented this.
At a spiritual level, even though they're just jokes, that's kind of how I feel. I don't really know what a serious option for the future. Like, the great value in Trump is that for a lot of normal people, they kind of woke up and they realized, wow, the president is constantly being hemmed in and harassed by all of these bureaucratic institutions, the deep state. So he's being attacked by the State Department, the Pentagon, the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, Secret Service. And you think, okay, formally the president's supposed to have authority over all these bodies, and he doesn't. He's like chained to his chair.
Yeah.
And so it's nice when you have Biden because he's like a corpse. So you just have to wheel him around. It's like Weekend at Bernie's. You just wheel him around, and he's
Weekend at Biden's. Yeah.
He's like a dead guy. I mean, I like the conspiracy that he's been dead for a while. He's just a hologram.
Yeah, they put a robotic interface in him.
But I don't think that's true. But it does demonstrate how the system works, and
it's spiritually true. It's spiritually true.
Yeah, it's spiritually true.
But I think like it feels the romantic vision that people have, like boomers especially, of like something about America, of like the lone soldier, the sort of who was the Vietnam one, Daniel Boone, or no, that not Vietnam.
Yeah, but I know what you're saying. Yeah,
you know what I mean. Like the institutions are against him. He's in there. He's kind of like a Davy Crockett at the Alamo. Like, it's like Trump is like the Alamo.
And I think that's why, you have this sort of spiritual identification with Q boomers about John Kennedy and Trump. And they're these sort of lone romantic figures who stood up against the establishment. And there's some truth to that for Kennedy. I think the best argument is he's sort of Caesarist. He was going to basically create a family dynasty running the federal government. But one man standing against these institutions is the efficacy or the long-term longevity of these changes are
not very good, actually.
The chances, they're not good. Maybe if Trump was actually Caesarist, but he's not appointing Don Jr. and Eric Trump, or these guys are kind of stupid anyway. But he's not appointing them to any positions of authority or influence. The only person he's done that with is Jared Kushner.
I heard this. Pedro Gonzalez. I mean, I have my criticisms of him, but he was posting basically how Jared Kushner had like the keys to the kingdom, and like he weaseled his way into like the Trump admin.
So I mean, but that's if you want Trump to be a Caesarist, that's the only Caesarism that he's really done, is like the Trump Kushner dynasty with Ivanka and Jared Kushner succeeding him. There's all the memes about Barron Trump, but he's still a kid, and things happen so quickly. So listen,
Galactic God Emperor Trump will punish our lib enemies by making them watch his galactic let's plays of Minecraft for all eternity in the brain cell machines, while we delve into cosmic Mars Imperium. Barron Trump's going to do it. He's going to be God Emperor Barron Trump. So he's going to lead us into our Faustian Giga Chadwin future.
These are all fun, but I'm not sure at any real level. I also don't like all the stupid localist people who think you could just get off the grid and make your own Hobbit house.
Homestead.
Hobbit
naturalism, as Keith Woods calls it,
Even though some of that stuff is important, people should know basic skills of how to take care of a home and be able to provide for themselves. But that's not really a solution either. I made a comment one time, I think Nixon was much more of a threat to to the deep state until Watergate got him, and that's a whole other story, because he knew how all these bureaucracies work, and he was actively destroying them. So unless you have somebody who can do something like that, I don't really see that there's hope that anything will change in the near future.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, as much as I hope for Trump, I mean, the hope is that Trump's going to run again, and then he's going to like vanquish all of his enemies. He's going to become a dark, like that. I think like, was it you or was it the bureaucrat that had this take about Nixon that I found like quite fascinating, where there was a time because of Vietnam or because of various instabilities in the American population, that the media in particular was sort of viewed with suspicion, and there was a growing sort of what we have nowadays, like anti-media sentiment, anti-fifth estate sentiment. No, wait, fourth estate?
Yeah.
And it's fifth column. Yeah. But then Nixon, actually, when they persecuted him, that restored the faith in the American media for at least up until Reagan. And like that was like a godsend for the media, because now they could be like these, impassioned Dan Rather defenders of public life. Like,
I think I was probably bureaucrat, but Yeah, it's exactly what happened. I mean, I see that it's sort of interesting. You have these sort of really hawkish right-wing military types
Yeah.
that have this horseshoe political alliance with these liberal professionals and media figures. And yeah, yeah, it was this great, yeah, it was a godsend for them because people didn't trust journalists. Um, and Vietnam seemed to be shaking everyone's confidence. Um, but the one I've seen one guy, I think it was Barack Obama,
Barack
um,
Obama, yeah.
but he made a point I thought was interesting that there are these personal similarities between DeSantis and Nixon in terms of
Mm.
like their ability to know how bureaucracies work and actively destroy them. Now, I'm not saying that's a reason to be pro DeSantis because who knows what he would do if he had that office. But you watch what he's doing in Florida and how he's kind of reorganizing the whole state. Where in 2018, I think it was 2018 when he won office, it was pretty close. Now DeSantis's Florida is like solid red for any
It's the
foreseeable
People's
future.
Republic. It's the People's Republic of DeSantis. It's the
Or maybe instead of
DeSantis
being
People's Republic. People will have their own militia, but
people,
that's People's
yeah,
Republic.
that's right. I like the
Yeah.
memes are also funny, but maybe there's a figure like that, not to be totally black pilled on DeSantis as like an establishment crony, but I mean
Yeah.
Nixon kind of appeared as an establishment crony, and then
Oh,
he
very
went
much.
to work. And so who knows? It's kind of a crapshoot on what would the future be if there was a President DeSantis.
Yeah.
Um, unless somebody guts these bureaucracies and starts to scale down radically, I don't really see hope that the United States government or state would ever be a source of good.
Well, I was thinking about this point last night, um, after reading your articles, that really what needs to happen is a total and complete gutting of like all the fish guts must come out of the GOP.
Yeah,
The Giesler old perverts. Like really, I think, in my opinion, there are certain people within, and I'm not even American, but I could see this. There are certain actors within the Republican Party that, in my opinion, are more dangerous than any lib or any like AOC,
right.
like symbolic leftoid. Like I think that the Republicans, like if you're a Republican, if you're a conservative in America, you have to realize the real enemy, which is the GOP, and it needs to be restructured. Not the destruction
Yeah,
of the GOP, because that's like impossible, but I mean like the restructuring of it. And I do see like some signs of you know, candidates like Blake Masters or Joe Kent. But then, like you were saying, like you're skeptical of the Thiel network because um it's not that Thiel like truly believes the way that say the Kremlin believes in like or Red Square in Beijing believes in like multipolarity and like going again like in other
yeah,
words he's not like an Islamo-Duganist or whatever, like he's not talking about the Atlanticists or whatever, because apparently I heard he's personally like pro blue yellow. You're just saying that and again this is a point that my friend Goran on the War Report said, that Peter Thiel, but more so who's that one guy? He blocked me on Twitter. I can't believe it. I hate him so much. The Hazoni guy. The what's his first name? Yoam?
Yoram Hazoni.
Yeah, Heram Yoram Hazoni. Like, yeah. He like basically, because he's dissatisfied with liberalism the way it is now, he associates with people that he considers scum. And he like the
Yeah,
whole NatCon thing. Like, do you think that the NatCon thing and like Peter Thiel, they're trying to do fundamentally the same thing? Like, what is their end game there?
I mean, with Thiel creating things like Palantir, I think they share the same vision. It's just about the structure of how it will come about. And so
Mm,
you need to sort of slough off some of these global commitments so you can reorganize to have a more effective global American presence that's not so ideological, which
mm.
alienates a lot of people. And the way the ham-fisted, you know, Black Lives Matter ideology approach that
Moralist, yeah.
is alienates a lot of Europeans because they're treated like garbage. And maybe they are garbage, but you don't want to invest all this money in them. Maybe you have to kind of restructure this relationship. So I see it as there is a paradigm from sort of libertarian spheres back in the day. There was a book, forget the author's name, but it's called The Yankee Cowboy War. And it was a paradigm of understanding the establishment as it is, sort of that Washington establishment from the 1940s and 50s, which he called Yankees, the old money East Coast figures. And then you had these cowboys who were these new money Southwest types. And so if you were to apply that paradigm, like the Teal network is sort of on the outsides. They're not like outsiders that they're completely shut out, but they're on the sort of fringe or outside of the center of power, and they're trying to break in. And so this marks out the kind of political struggle. I don't know how much in the sort of the big scope of things would change, because you can't forget Operation Warp Speed was Trump's idea. There's big giveaway to pharmaceutical companies came from Trump. But on the other hand, you have to make pragmatic decisions. Like it's Biden mandates or Trump just sort of shrugs his shoulders and says, "Well, you take it if you want it. It's good. It's great. It's the best." But
yeah, it's the best. Yeah.
And so,
if he was like truly outside, he'd be like, he would just have money. Like he would be like the My Pillow guy. He would be like totally on the outside. Yeah.
So again, you make pragmatic choices. It's possible, again, because Nixon was somebody who was a Republican establishment figure. He crawled his way to the top, fighting off, people to the left and to the right of him.
Yeah.
But then when he took over, he had a very particular kind of vision, and he knew how to use power. So, like whatever networks people are beholden to does not determine their use of power. So a Trump or a DeSantis or whoever could buck the authority of whatever people or network that put him in power and kind of pursue his own ends and agendas. So that's where the sort of conspiracy left stuff sometimes breaks down, because just because you're part of a network doesn't mean you can't think for yourself, or you're going to try to violate that network or restructure it for different purposes. I'm not saying there's doom entirely. I don't see anything possible in the immediate future, but then you never know. Somebody, another Trump presidency, a DeSantis presidency, somebody else that nobody's even aware of.
How did you start your interest in Giorgio Agamben? And I know that you recommended his. I remember I was reading his book on the commentary of the Letters to Rome, Letters to Rome, or
Letter to the Romans.
Yeah, Letters to the Romans, by St. Paul, and he was talking about the sort of word of like the word the double entendre of the word slave, and how it has different meaning and connotation. But in this essay, I guess to start off with the hardest essay, you were talking about the nature of bureaucracy and the nature of the separation of powers in both the celestial hierarchy and various millenarian regimes that people like Carl Schmitt talk about, mirroring the celestial hierarchy. And I thought, like, I was thinking of an art piece I could potentially do if I had the skills one day to do like the ring of like people in business suits and bureaucrats mimicking the sort of the Raphael paintings of the celestial hierarchy, but to go through that, there was this one part of the essay. Let me bring it up here. This is, I was sort of confused here. So the essay is called "The Glorious Empty Throne as Exposition of Agamben's The Kingdom in Glory," or Power and Glory. By the way, that is a wrestling move, the Power and Glory. It's a tag team move where you give a guy a superplex and then your opponent gives the guy a frog splash.
So maybe that's the solution, right? Because it's the kingdom and the glory, and there's no power. But what you really need is the power and the glory. You got superplex the bureaucrat.
Yeah, exactly. So this is at the very end. I have to choose some certain OPSEC words throughout this, of course. But the emperor would not exist without the crown of the purple. So in ancient Rome, they would wear the vestibules of both the military and the imperial purple. But then you said something very interesting at the very end. You said, the anarchy of power will continue to operate as long as the political liturgy of mass democracy continues. The modern West has become what Ivan Illich has called the most explicitly Christian era, a time of never-ending apocalypse. The only solution must come from within alternative political theology, and it was the one that St. Paul had declared. Christ crucified was not a step in the horizon of history of salvation, which constituted the redemption of humanity. Rather, Christ is crucified in the eternal revelation of God. The angelic and the human ministers who had only expanded the government of Torah in order to carry it through human translation. So you were talking about before this how it's not that that God can destroy human power, but rather he can suspend or temporarily annul, or I believe the word is I forget the exact word, but
well, Agamben draws on Walter Benjamin's idea of a dialectical standstill.
Yeah.
So it's not about synthesis. There's no reunification. There's a kind of fracture. So one of the big thing Agamben, and it's just this is sort of like a prolegomena before I answer the question, what does that passage mean?
Yeah.
Agamben, a lot of Agamben's work is looking at all of the dualities that exist.
The paradoxes and duality. Yeah.
It exists throughout political and theological thought. So obviously theological is God in the world. How do they interact? How do they touch? You have the fundamental political question that you see first really theorized by Aristotle, the difference between the oikos, the household, versus the polis, the city. And the question is like, how do you move between? So the main thing that Agamben's always interested in is not the duality itself, but the mediation between them. How do households transform into a city? At what point do you leave the city and you're just in a household? Like, how do these two exist? And
it's sort of like Homo sacer. How can you exist within the law but abandon it outside of the law?
Right. So that's the problem is that you can get lost in this space. And so Agamben, his main focus is that fundamentally we live in an anarchic society, but in one that's bad. We like an anarchy of power where it's just pure violence,
anarcho-tyranny.
And then the alternative though for Agamben is that fundamentally the world is anarchic in the sense that it lacks any foundation. There's no between these dualities trying to answer the question of like chicken or egg, like which one came first, the city and a bunch of brothers that then separated into their own households, or did
the household first? Yeah.
And Agamben's strange answer is that neither happened. Actually, the space between them is the thing that first exists,
which is a very postmodern, post-structuralist move.
This, in the use of bodies, when he talks about mediation, what he calls like mediated ontology, or he talks about this weird passage in Leibniz where Leibniz talks about the monads, these sort of self-contained worlds, but they relate to each other. There's a bond that connects them. And he talks about the substantial bond is more primary than the monads themselves. And he compares it to an original echo. So the echo actually precedes the voice. And it's a sort of strange, sort of mystical way of approaching this. But
most rationalists that do Leibniz, they forget about this, by the way.
Leibniz was somebody who was, he was not like this sort of crude Wolffian, which is what, Kant and everyone else, Hume, react against in the 18th, 19th century. But the point Agamben makes is that theologically, this angelic hierarchy represents sort of government. So another key binary in political history is the state or the sovereign versus the government. You have the fountain of legitimacy, and then you have the those who carry it out. And he uses the Arthurian myth of the Fisher King.
Yes, who's wounded by the. Go ahead. Yes, I'm not too familiar. I've heard of the Fisher King when Young talked about it, but he's wounded and. Right. But go ahead.
But what Agamben notes about the Fisher King is king. He's legitimate, but he can't actively govern. He's wounded. He has to stay at home. He eats basically the Eucharist and he goes fishing, and so he governs through all of his ministers, all these people who act in the name of the king. But of course, the king, nobody sees the king. The king can't personally involve himself in anything. And what Agamben notes is that the sort of theological vision how does God govern the world? He governs it through this celestial ministry. He governs it through an earthly ministry, through the
Through the
priesthood.
acts, you said the acts are more important than the actual manifestation of. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's you. Okay, yeah, that's another part, but that's important too. But basically, you have this expansion of government, and theologically, this is justified as well. The more glorious a king, the more ministers he has, right? A less glorious king would have to do everything by himself, but a super glorious king would have this unlimited number of people who are serving him from all the way at the top, at the highest positions, all the way at the bottom. And what Agamben wants to note about how democracy works is that you have no sovereign. Like the sovereignty doesn't exist. It's just a government drawing its life force from the sovereign. So the idea in kind of an artistic rendering would be an empty chair, right?
Right.
And so when it comes to democracy, the sovereign in every democratic polity is the people, but there is no people. It doesn't exist. And so it's basically, heaven is empty and it's a bunch of angels running around claiming that there's a God and drawing legitimacy from that divine power, but it doesn't exist. And so, you could qualify this as a kind of political atheism, is that democracy is all one big fabrication because there is no people. However, the way that you blind people from seeing that, blind individuals from seeing that, is this constant worship and valorization in liturgizing of the sovereign. And he you mentioned the point about the sort of Romans wearing this military gear. Agamben makes the point where it's like sovereign depictions of power become depictions of basically the unmoving stone-like sovereign figure. The king can't get up; he'll ruin the whole pageant and decorum. He can't actually carry out his sentences, and so you see this transition from the era of the consulate, where the lictors and the consul, the symbols of power or the mechanisms of power, right? You beat people or execute them using the fasces, to the point where now the emperor can't even move. He just has to sit in his chair like a statue. And the more statue-like he is, the more glorious he appears. And so this is why you have this constant valorization of democracy. Oh, we got to make the world safe for democracy. We got to protect democracy. But then when you have these manifestations of things like plebiscites or condemning what people crudely just sort of grab bag term called populism, you think you're condemning the people, but the whole point of the regime is to carry out the will of the people. And so there's this sort of mental kind of schizophrenia that has to take place. And all of it makes sense if you realize the whole purpose of democracy is not to effectively carry out the people's will. The people are immobile because they don't exist. And so every minister, all these people, all these powers, they draw their legitimacy from, I'm acting in the name of the people. But the people don't actually exist. So you have to have this constant swirl of activity, which is manifest in sort of the theological imagination. This is worship and incense and prayers and hymns and songs. But in a secular term in the 21st century, this is polling, votes, constantly trying to measure, what do we think about this? What do we think about that? What do the people want? And you need to constantly do this. You need constant elections. And you see this most chaotically in European social democracies. You see how many governments they keep going through. They have elections maybe twice a year sometimes.
Yeah, well, look at Italy. Italy's the best example or worst example of that.
That's not a bug. That's part of the solution. The more people that are involved in it, the more people who keep in this ritual worship, who think they are manifesting the will of the people, you're basically trying to fabricate a god. And Agamben mentions in one of his works, I think it's also in the use of bodies, but also maybe the sacrament of language, of these sociological investigations, like people like Emil Durkheim and they noticed these like Indian villages where people, their understanding of theology is that when you invoke the name of a god, you're not just calling the god to appear, you're actually making the god. And so this is this is what democracy is. We're trying to confect and manufacture this God called the people, but in reality, it's just a big phantom. It's just a way of constantly legitimating the bureaucrats and the people in charge. And this can reach nightmare proportions when this bureaucracy isn't just a couple of guys in Washington, D.C. It gets to its most nightmare proportions when everybody is considered a bureaucrat. Everybody becomes part of the deep state. And this is manifest in like snitch networks. Everybody's doing their part, this kind of communitarian virtue.
Exactly.
Statement.
You become an agent of power by snitching on your parents who went to the thing that happened in January a few years ago. Or 2 years ago. Yeah. It becomes or even like what Agamben talks about is like all of history flowing through the camps, which we'll get to. But like that is a scenario where, and he's taking Arendt's lead, of course, the origins of totalitarianism, where now the people as a sovereign, no longer is there that heliocentric model of Christendom that sustained Europe for thousands of years. Now it's the people become the sovereign, the people, not the sovereign in total, but rather they become a mediator of the sovereign. And that sort of celestial authority is brought back to earth. Then you get the camps. There was this one part where you said, I was very confused at the end, but now that you've made sense where this is the voided God or the God of emptiness, is it kind of like, is Giorgio Agamben approaching a similar argument to say de Juvenal, who says that in the ancient regime, power was very much real, it was felt, it was of a people that had various like impartial networks of connection to the sovereign. But then as time goes on, as power becomes more abstracted within the sovereign, then you get absolutism, and absolutism leads to liberal democracy in some
right. Because Benjamin notes this in his book on the origins of the Trauerspiel, the sort of German political tragedy as a play. That it's precisely the absolute sovereign when he has to make a choice that he destroys his kingdom, because he cannot. The point is that he can't make the decision because his will is absolute. You're going to end up alienating some part of the population, and you're going to create the conditions of civil war.
And he's not bounded by any other celestial authority the way that, like, even the divine right of kings was relatively recent, because that was just understood that religious authority played a part within the network of the ancient regime. But
so, I mean, Agamben's point is that ancient people had ways of, even though there was this sort of foundational anarchy within politics, especially the Greeks, they had ways of ritually crisscrossing between this threshold. So his book on civil war, Stasis, is about this, about how Greeks, everything would get confused in civil war. Your family would turn into political enemies. Your political allies would become like your brothers. But then when the time
Euripides talks about this, during the Peloponnesian War. Not the Peloponnesian War, is it the Peloponnesian War? The one, the Iliad, what was it called?
The Trojan War.
The Trojan War, yeah. Like Euripides talks about this with the wife of Agamemnon. Was it the wife? No, it's the wife of Hector, who becomes a prostitute, or not a prostitute, she becomes a concubine for the son of Agamemnon, and how basically houses turn on each other. And in Greek,
But his point is that Greeks had a way of resolving this, and then they would reestablish the boundaries. But the modern world has lost all ability to do this, in an increasing way, so that precisely what Greeks would call amnestia or amnesty, which was a political forgetting of the events. You can't use what happened in the Civil War against people once it's over.
But our politics are based on this.
Yeah, but that's the modern.
And that other event that happened, that's like the whole theological grounding of.
Right. Never forget that. Never forgive. Never forget. And that means you're basically politically constipated. That the conditions of civil war will never end.
Yeah.
Whatever the details of it is, it is this founding myth.
Yeah.
And that, but that it's a myth that will never cease. It wasn't in the past. It's a recurrent and recurring phenomenon.
Everything is happening. We have to bomb Baghdad because it's going to happen. We have to invade Russia because it's going to happen again. We have to get rid of the Chuds in America in the heartland because it'll happen again. Like, it's always that reoccurring, like,
it's happening.
Yeah, it's happening. Yeah, it's right around the corner. So you were saying this is fascinating. I think that, I mean, and Agamben gets this from Foucault in the sense of the operations of power relies in the interaction of between those entities within that network. So the prison guard and the prisoner,
Yeah.
or now we have, according to the Hewell-Chanian notion of psychopolitics, now we have this participatory form of it. But Agamben, he takes that, but he is, of course, unlike Foucault, not very grounded in historical, the most succinct historical analysis of Michel Foucault. Agamben's a legal scholar that takes from Roman juridical legal scholarship,
Right.
and he knows that there were all these paradoxes that, like you were saying, and again, this is very postmodernist and the linguistic turn in post-structuralism, that it's the interaction or the intertextual nature between those entities that matter. So, for example, you were mentioning the use of bodies, how, and even a forgetting in the sense is like, well, there's a paradox between what is the people, and what is the sovereign, how the sovereign exercises power, how the sovereign is in the law but outside of the law. He gets it from Schmidt as well, not just Foucault, Schmidt. Do you know that one part where he's talking about, and I know this is the base of like these critical animal people, but he was talking about this in The Open, how the open is like this interaction between things rather than like a solid entity of what is a human, what is an animal, what is a non-human animal. It's like, what is the operation between how these things interact? And so he gets this from Michel Foucault, and he also gets this from Deleuze, where they're talking about the becoming of things more significant, like the becoming of a power network, the becoming of biopower is more,
The problem with this, and this is in Agamben's somewhat subtle criticism of Foucault in the use of bodies, is that Foucault's method and his sort of implicit solutions are reflected in his views about S&M. And that when it comes down to the fact that all kinds of individualities are kind of arbitrary and a product of power relations, you basically can solve this by turning it into one large role-playing experiment. And so you have the sort of contradictory circular reality in an S&M role play where the dominant person is actually the slave, because the dominant person is doing what the submissive wants, and the submissive person is actually in control of the game because he's telling.
It's funny. I just reviewed the film on the Patreon portion of the solo episode of the Duke of Burgundy, which is exactly like that. That's the ending. The lesbian sub is actually in control. So
right. So this is the nature of it. And Foucault thinks this is wonderful and magical, and and this results in sort of his like orgiastic.
Care of the self, period.
You lose yourself at life, death, body parts. It's all this just like melange. And
and the work of art takes this as well. People like Marilyn Minter and other ones, they run with this in the work of art. But Francis Bacon, go ahead. Sorry, I keep cutting you off.
No, it's Agamben's subtle kind of muted criticism is that this doesn't really solve anything. This just says everything is then chaotic and great. I mean, who cares? And that's not a real solution. This is, and again, this is manifest. I think Zizek talks about like Foucault in 1968, and his students are like, why are we protesting for gay rights? Like, isn't this just another manifestation of power? And the answer is like, yeah, but whatever. That's, who cares? And so this is not a real solution to the philosophical problem. For Agamben, the idea, and he has a very kind of childlike, playful approach to things. But the real solution is basically forcing everything to stop. In this, this is what he calls the dialectical of standstill, where you're able to just become aware of the gap between everything, the gap between soul and body, the gap between men and women, the gap between state and government. And this is what allows the whole machinery to deactivate. So if this liturgy of power that's constantly celebrating democracy stops, and maybe that's the most radical thing that could happen, if people just stop voting, if nobody filled out surveys, democracy, the whole illusion, the whole dance, the constant motion, the constant becoming and transformation would stop. And this is
We
what
would
he
step
means.
off the wheel of samsara of life, death, of democracy.
Right. The only way to do it, and this he talks about this is like in his book on the Pulcinella character from kind of folk Italian art
Oh
is
yeah, sad clown. Yeah.
you have the only way to escape is in the middle of things. You can't there's no beginning, there's no end. You just have to stop now, which is why the crucifixion of Christ, what that isn't this is the next stage of salvation history. And if you approach time that way, you can make that argument, which Nietzsche and others have made, is that Christian time has been secularized, and that's just the linear progressive time of just one event, another event, and then you can mythologize this as progress. Oh, things are getting better, everything's moving. Wait, to what? What is the end?
All the way to kingdom come. Yeah.
So you keep going. And Agamben's point is that really, if you read St. Paul, the whole point of Christian revelation, which the early church kind of it got a little mixed up with other things, according to Agamben, which I can explain that more if you want. But
sure.
The early vision of St. Paul is that the revelation of Christ is not the next step in time. It is sort of the revealing of the inner workings of time, or the way it's said that the Lamb of God was slain at the foundations of the world. That this is something that what you see on the cross of Christ and the resurrection is you see laid bare the foundations of everything, and everything stops. Right? There is no next step. You can escape from this world. You can live according to the new world now, here and now. So usually this is juxtaposed in New Testament literature as this age and the age to come, or focusing on the now time. So every time Jesus says like, look, listen, right? Judgment is here. This is this awareness that you can escape from this world. And so his one book that focuses on this is called The Highest Poverty, about St. Francis of Assisi and the early Franciscans. And it was this recognition that by Francis choosing to become like Christ, to choosing to live this kind of way in a self-conscious sort of way, you can then find your way out of the sort of forces that require you to just adopt an identity, or become molded by economic forces, or the kind of generic stuff you see on both the old school Marxist left wing, but also kind of identity politics left. So he uses, at the end of the use of body, he examines Plato's myth of which is this story of people choosing, when you die, you choose to be reincarnated. And the point of the myth, according to Agamben, is that you can stop yourself in the midst of life, and you can then choose your form of life. Right? How do I want to live my life? I'm not determined by biology. I'm not determined by culture. I'm not determined by economic forces. I can stop, and I can, like he also uses positively Herman Melville's Bartleby the Scrivener. If you can stop everything and say, I don't want to do this, I prefer not to, then the question arises, what do you prefer? And then that's the real spiritual freedom, where you're not just, oh, well, I'm moving on to the next step and the next step and the next step. You can just stop everything.
I think this is the neat aristocracy ideal, in my opinion. The neat incel aristocracy. Yeah. You can choose not to contribute to.
But then you can think about, what do I want to contribute? And then you can devote yourself to art, poetry, writing, essays, building
podcasts.
Things. Podcasts.
Art and podcast. Exactly. This is what do you think my life is? I am the ultimate revolutionary subject.
It's a joke, but that's really how Agamben sees things. Is that's the way out. I mean, at a widespread thing, you have to see these forces of democracy tumble, which he thinks, like social democracy, which is sort of funny in retrospect, because I'm surprised nobody gave him a lot of trouble about this. But Agamben says in his book on the Holocaust, and also in Homo Sacer, that social democracy plays with this sort of biological confusion far more than the Nazis did. They talk way more.
Oh my God! Oh, that's so based.
Right, but it's like because he talks about like medical ethics, where it just becomes like a pure will decision. Like nobody can tell what's the difference between someone who's alive and dead. This is a really hard question. So they just have to decide an act of law. And so Agamben is anti-Nazi, it's kind of generic. He's part of the European left. But the reason he's anti-Nazi is because National Socialism was trying to square the circle of kind of nationalist democracy that you saw in the French Revolution. Like, how do you have a society where everybody contributes? And this is what Schmidt, in his sort of his like National Socialist phase, he wrote a few articles about primal democracy or primitive democracy, not parliamentary democracy, which was sick and corrupted, but the sense where everyone is part of the body politic. It's like everyone is doing one giant Goku spirit bomb. Everyone's part of the Fuhrer, like destroying his enemies, but everyone's participating. But this is
all of society's one giant Nuremberg rally, like all the time.
That's the ideal. But then, of course, what do you do with those on the who don't fit? So you need, like, in the French Revolutionary case, you have these insane Jacobins who are like, just keep everyone in the Vendée and we can repopulate it.
Literally millions.
Right, but it's based on, like, you have to square the circle of this sort of liberal nationalism that emerged out of French Revolution, which is different than most of what American nationalism has meant. How you define nationalism is slightly different, but this kind of liberal nationalism in the sense of like a biological people rooted to land and culture, and politics is about them in control of their own fate, right? This is what Wilson wanted to deliver to all the European nations. The point Agamben wants to make is there's a kind of logical, there's a similarity in the logic of trying to square this circle, but the circle that's trying to be squared in the French case is different from the German. The French was far more universalistic. It was emphasized equality, right? I mean, brotherhood is common in National Socialism too, but it was not these universal values, which in retrospect and in a scholarly look at it, you can say, okay, well, these are not universal values. These are French values that are being projected all over Europe.
Onto the universe, the way that liberals project.
But you have like people like, I forgot his name. He was this German who ended up in the French National Assembly, something Cloutius, anarchist Cloutius. But he was like, talk about Paris as the center of the universe. And this is a very strange comment to make if you're talking about universal values. But nevertheless, that's what really separates Jacobins and National Socialists.
Yeah, they both have it's sort of like Bob Chipman or whatever. That's like they're the most honest liberals because they have their own version of millions must. But instead exactly. It's chuds must.
But it's the counter-revolutionaries in the Vendée. But then it's also right. How do you? This is where you get the most rabid Jacobins like Saint-Just. It's like, okay, but you have this new legal category between active citizens and passive citizens.
Yeah.
You can't have that. If you want a truly universal republic where everyone is participating in this, eternal Parisian, like democratic mob, the only way,
gods, no masters, type of.
The only way to do that is by all these people, and it's sort of like the same again. Two different objectives. One's universal, one's more national, ethnic focused. But squaring the circle for in the Vendée is not that different than massacring a bunch of Slavs in the East.
Yeah,
the same purpose. These people cannot be assimilated, at least in this mass. Again, it's more ideological in the French version and far more ethno-biological in the German version.
Oh, yes.
But it's the same attempt to solve this polity problem. If you want this primal democracy where everybody is part of the government, the only way you can do that is you have to off all the people who don't fit this. So, call the chuds, purge them, let them die in the hospital alone, and then we can have our ideological primal democracy.
I've heard people say this, that we should deny the chuds medical care because they didn't want to get the
that's the same kind of logic in National Socialism. And
this is what Agamben said, and he canceled for it.
Yeah,
he said
I know. It's so funny because he sounded just like a boomer comic.
Oh my god!
One of my best friends, rest in peace. He was like a Vietnam vet guy. And that's how he saw a lot of the things that were going on, the sorts of kind of conspiratorial stuff about chips and virtual reality stuff and biometric ID. Right, this was all part of the
like
mark of the beast.
illustrations type of mark of the beast. Yeah.
And so this was he died very early on in 2020, my friend Craig, but he
did he have
no, he had liver cancer and he was old.
Oh, I'm very sorry.
But he didn't live to see through all the mania. But it's what he'd been talking about, and he's like this sort of like boomercon Christian kind of
conspiracy theorist.
Yeah, conspiracy theorist. And then it all happens, and then like Agamben, who's like the darling public intellectual of Italy, makes the exact same argument. Being turned into Jew, be put on trains, and he got canceled for that. You have these ideological constraints which Agamben doesn't focus on, but the sort of medicalization of politics, where the only political question is this apocalypse of it's the human race. We either die or we live, and we can strip away every liberty, every piece of culture. Right? Agamben wrote in his book on all these interviews he did about virus.
Yeah, like, where are they now? Where are they now? Yeah.
Yeah, where they are now. This like the quarantine logic. Nothing had been done this brutal before, where their bodies were being burned in Italy because they were contaminated. People were not allowed to have funerals. You
couldn't go to church. No public engagement.
Yeah, like one of my acquaintances on Twitter, he's living in Italy. He's an American, and he's like he couldn't go outside for a cigarette. The cop would tell you to get back in your house.
Yeah.
And so Italy was one of the most brutal places in Europe, strangely enough, for its long stereotype and tradition of government incompetence. But it had like the most brutal response of any European country. And for some reason,
if Italy didn't do that, then the rest of the world wouldn't have either. There's one theory about that if Italy didn't do these brutal lockdowns, the rest of the world wouldn't. But then China did it anyways, so they were following the China model, ironically enough, even though they caused the problem to begin with. But anyways, sorry, go ahead, Cal.
So this kind of logic is what when I cite Illich, which Agamben only mentions once. He doesn't really interact with Illich, but
no.
Illich talks about this, and Agamben quotes this about being this era is the most Christian era of any time. And what he means by that is, Illich is a Catholic.
Yes.
But
he was a priest, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, he was a rogue priest who was, harassed by the magisterium.
Yeah.
He also got his university department in Germany to like pay for all the wine him and his students would drink while they were having like seminars. It was part of like the academic environment. So they would like buy like gallons of wine for him, which is pretty cool. But Illich's point is not anti-Christian, is that precisely this is this corruption of Christianity in the same way that Christian revelation, which is supposed to be the end of time, as in the sense that this is the purpose, this is its conclusion. It's turned into just, it's another step. It's another step. It's another step. And when this is secularized, this becomes sort of that modernist Christian / progressive view of everything is moving. Time is all moving towards this particular end, whether it's this apocalyptic finale, like, in traditional Marxist eschatology, where, you have the final battle between the proletariat and the bourgeois, and then you have about the kulaks. Or if it's not a violent apocalyptic scenario, you're constantly moving towards utopia that's always vanishing, for that kind of progressive era. But in any case, time keeps going on, where the purpose of Christian theology is to say, actually, time has stopped, right? The revelation of the cross and the resurrection is that moment where you see the very foundation of everything. Okay, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. Sorry, finish your point.
Oh, okay. So the purpose is then revealed in sort of St. Paul's Ethics, which is what Agamben talks about in The Time That Remains, which is the commentary on the letter to the Romans, is that Paul constantly talks about the time is short. The time is short. We have to do things now. And this has been misinterpreted as this over-realized apocalypse. Like Paul was waiting for Jesus to come back in 15 years, and then he didn't. And so then you have to sort of deal with that embarrassment. And that's what Christian theology is. But Agamben's point is that no, Paul is is realizing that, it's not that 15 years Jesus is going to come, is that nothing is going to happen in this sort of temporal earthly sense. It's that you now are freed from these social conditions, not to abolish them, but to gut them of their significance. And so this is why you have all these role reversals, right? Masters know that you have a master and then serve your servants, and servants know that you have that you are a free man.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean abolishing slavery, or it doesn't mean changing these social roles and creating some revolutionary commune or leveling. But when these roles are removed from their deep ontological significance, when it's real, me being a master, me being a slave, these roles could reverse at any time. It's just choosing to live a certain way. And so for Agamben, the clear ethic for Paul is when he says as not. So those who are married live as not. Those who are rich live as not. Right? You do not find a sense of identity from these social or cultural kind of things. It's that they're always for use. And that's where they become corrupt, is where they become definitive or ontological. You always put them to use. So if you're a master, you make use of the fact that you're a master. If you're a servant, you make use of the fact that you're a servant. If you're a man or a woman, you're married or single, rich or poor, you make use of that. And this then allows you to then live a kind of free life, because you're not defined by these social, economic, or cultural appendages. You are free to then just sort of be however you want to be. So, to kind of make it crude, Agamben's core philosophy is just be yourself.
Yeah. Be here now. Yeah.
But the only way to free yourself from that is not by, trying to manufacture some identity, but it's just realizing that all the things that you have in your life, you can kind of become self-aware of them, and then you use them to whatever purposes you want.
Well, this is his point in profanations, right? Like, what is a profanation? It's to deliver something sacred into use for the common good. But then he talks about pornography is different than what you would think about it. Like the work of art becomes instrumentalized. His
whole emphasis is on the threshold. And there are two ways of going about recognizing this division that these exist, right? Between the home and the political, between sovereign and government, all these things. There's two ways of addressing the threshold. One way, which is the bad way for Agamben, is you try to flatten it all out. You try to resolve the contradiction, which then leads to the camp, it leads to these places where what cannot exist exists, and it needs to be banished.
Yeah, because if you say that everyone is a sovereign in this society governed by this structure, whether it be the sort of equality, fraternity, what was the third one? Equality, liberty,
brotherhood, fraternity, equality, liberty.
Yeah, or if it's the National Socialist, biological, racial element, by definition, those who lie outside of that sovereign do not conform to those standards, and therefore millions must die. They must go. But
he makes a point. It's not millions must die in that we are fighting a political enemy. It's millions must in this very biologized sense, where you're just removing lice from the body politic.
Antibodies removing diseases.
It's disease, it's infection, it's a vermin. It's not. Yeah. It's the same logic of how do you purify what should not exist. It cannot exist, and therefore it must not exist in some legal way. So that's why you have to exclude these people. No longer are under the law, but then that subjects it to the full force of the law's violence.
Exactly. So it's literally this cold bureaucratic hand of these people are literally erased from the ledger of the law because they don't. Yeah. But two things though.
And again, to emphasize, Agamben thinks social democracy has perfected this chaos in a way that even National Socialists would never have dreamed of.
Yeah, with refugees and with various other excluded groups, the olds, the people, and he talks about this in Homo Sacer. But is it similar to in this Christian eschatological turn? Is it similar to, for example, what Girard says in that Christ represents the final sacrifice, the breaking of all other laws, the breaking of all taboos. He is it. He is the quintessence of all history. It all filters through Christ in that sacrifice.
Yeah,
In the last,
I think there's definitely consonance with the Girardian idea that this is about the shattering of this system, and the
yeah,
temptation is always to rebuild it in a new way. So
yes, yeah,
by thinking that there's something you have to work towards, there's some future utopia that we're building. This is precisely the problem, and by creating Christian theology around this in one way or the other, instead of emphasizing this break in time, this is what then becomes secularized into modern linear time and the secular utopias and the secular eschatologies of Marxism,
yeah.
Fourierism, and progressivism, and all the other various
Would you
things.
say fascism is like that as well, or no?
You know, some ways in valorizing the state as the sort of final end, there is a kind of fascist eschatology that we're finally arrived. We're all part of the state. We're all part of this big machine, kind of like organic robot Hobbesian Leviathan. But then, you know, a lot of people who are fascists were pragmatic. Like, we don't want to get commies. We don't want their country to be economically dissolved because of the huge...
We're preventing the contagion of Marxism from spreading, as they said in
a very pragmatic way. And so, you know, there's all sorts of varieties of fascism, but, you know, I take the Gottfried pill on this, where it's like fascism hasn't existed since the 1940s. It was a very time specific kind of movement, and it reflected a lot of different visions, but it was all in response to the shattering of European nations and the rising threat of class warfare, of, you know, proletariat thugs in the name of unions and the Communist Party just beating people who would not submit.
After the decline of monarchies as well, that was another big
thing. Yeah. You don't have, the king doesn't seem to be able to do anything or willing to do anything.
Thank you, everyone, for listening to the Content Minded podcast. If you wish to support me and to unlock every full and uncensored version of each week's podcast, please go to patreon.com/GiantArtProductions. You will not only get every full and uncensored version of Content Minded, but you will also get exclusive content, such as my Giant Art Reviews series, where I analyze and pick apart various interesting and insightful books or essays. Every episode will be uploaded to Anchor, which will upload them to Spotify, as well as my backup channel on Odyssey. Please look out for new content every single week, and please look out for the Digital Archipelago with me and the Prudentialist. Thank you once again to all of my beautiful patrons. Thank you all for keeping the content renaissance alive. As I always say, God bless and goodbye.